Hey guys, tonight we are stepping through a nearly invisible door in time, leaving the hum of your refrigerator and the glow of your screen behind. We're traveling to the heart of a global superpower, but not to its battlefields or its throne room. We're here to witness a quiet revolution, one that started not with a bang, but with the gentle pour of a strange, black, bitter liquid. A word of warning, though if you were actually dropped there, your modern sensibilities might not get you through the first day. The social etiquette alone is a minefield. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support truly means the world. And while you're at it, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your city and the current time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see where our little community gathers from when the world goes quiet. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air that greets you is thick, layered with the history of 1,000 years. It's late afternoon, and the sun, a great, molten gold clay, is beginning its slow descent behind the hills of the European side, casting long, dramatic shadows that stretch from the domes of the Hagia Sophia to the waters of the Golden Horn. The day's final call to prayer, the Isha, begins to echo from 100 minarets, a cascading, melodic summons that washes over the city, calling the faithful to their last prayers of the day. You're standing on a cobblestone street in the Tot, a Kale district, a bustling commercial maze of a neighborhood just a stone's throw from the Grand Bazaar. The relentless energy of the day is finally starting to subside. The cacophony of merchants hawking their wares, silks from Persia, spices from the East, jewels from India, is softening into the rhythmic clatter of wooden shutters being pulled down and locked. A shopkeeper sweeps the front of his stall, the bristles of his broom whispering against the stone. The crowd thins. You can finally walk without constantly bumping shoulders with a Janissary in his distinctive felt cap, a Greek merchant gesticulating wildly, or a donkey laden with sacks of grain. The air smells of salt from the nearby sea, of roasting chestnuts from a street-side brazier, and of the sweet, sticky promise of honey dripping from a tray of baklava in a pastry shop you just passed. You're not just aimlessly wandering, though. You're looking for something. You've heard whispers, fragments of conversation in the marketplace, tales of a new kind of place. It's not a meeting, one of the city's many taverns where wine flows and inhibitions are lowered, often to the disapproval of the authorities. And it's not a Biozi Hain, serving the thick, slightly fermented millet drink that has been a staple for centuries. No, this is something entirely different. The stories describe a place where men gather not to get intoxicated, but to become sharper, clearer. They call it a Coffeehouse, a coffeehouse. As true darkness begins to settle, the city transforms. There are no electric street lit here. This is a world lit by the moon, the stars, and the flickering, personal glow of hand-held lanterns. This is a fascinating little detail of the era. Public space after dark was a void to be navigated personally. Wealthier citizens might have servants carrying ornate lanterns ahead of them, while you, a more modest time traveler, might just have a simple clay lamp with a sputtering wick. Historians often point out that this lack of public lighting fundamentally shaped social life, making nighttime a time for either private gatherings or for those with specific, sometimes illicit, business. You hear the rhythmic tap-tap-tapping of a BKCI, the neighborhood night watchman, striking his staff on the cobblestones to announce his presence and ward off troublemakers. You walk on, following a rumor, a direction pointed out by a spice merchant who had a strange, energized glint in his eye. He told you to look for a place that smelled like burnt grain, but in a good way. A truly helpful description. The very existence of this place is a matter of some debate, by the way. But as with so much of history, the official record might just be the moment something became too big to ignore. Historians still debate this, sifting through old property records and court documents. Was it really 1554? Or did smaller, unrecorded ventures exist years, or even a decade, earlier, operating quietly in the city's labyrinthine alleys? The truth is, a revolution rarely has a precise, universally agreed upon start date. You turn a corner, leaving the slightly wider thoroughfare for a narrow, winding alley. The air here is still, and then you smell it. It's a scent that's completely alien to this 16th century world, yet strangely familiar to you. It's not burned. It's roasted. A deep, rich, slightly bitter aroma that cuts through the other city smells. It's coming from a low, unassuming wooden building up ahead. A soft, wood, honey-colored light spills from its doorway, and you can hear a low, steady murmur from within, not the raucous laughter of a tavern, but the gentle hum of conversation, like a beehive of thought. You found it. That aroma is drawing you closer, pulling you in like a gentle, invisible current. Let's pause here for a moment, right on the threshold, and just analyze it. You try to place it in your mental library of smells, but it's difficult. It has the deep, comforting bitterness of baked bread crust, but also a sharper, almost floral note, like scorched flowers. There's a hint of dark chocolate, a whisper of soil, and a strange, compelling acidity. To the people of this city, this is a completely new sensory experience. They have no words for it yet, no memories attached to it. For you, it's the ghost of a million morning routines, but stripped of its modern context, it feels primal and mysterious. This smell comes from a drink called Kuehua, and the story of how it got here, to this doorstep in Istanbul, is a journey in itself. It's not a story of conquest, but of quiet discovery and slow, creeping adoption. Our story begins far to the south, on the Arabian Peninsula, in the highlands of Yemen. It's there, in the 15th century, that Sufi mystics at their secluded monasteries discovered a secret. They were devotees of a mystical branch of Islam, and their rituals, known as dhikr, involved long nights of chanting and prayer to feel closer to God. But human bodies are frail. Staying awake, focused, and spiritually alert for hours on end is a monumental task. Then, they found the coffee berry. Ureda. They learned how to use it. They would toast the seeds, the beans, and brew them into a dark, potent, and incredibly bitter drink. It was a revelation. The drink sharpened their minds, banished fatigue, and allowed them to perform their devotions with a new level of intensity. They named it Kuehwa, an old Arabic poetic term for wine, ironically repurpose-swapping the name of a forbidden substance for their holy elixir. To them, it wasn't a recreational beverage. It was a spiritual tool, a gift from God to aid the devout. This is the mainstream, accepted history. Coffee as we know it was born out of religious devotion in the Sufi orders of Yemen. But of course, there's always a more whimsical story, a folktale whispered alongside the historical facts. This one is the truly niche little tidbit. The legend takes us even further back, across the Red Sea to the highlands of Ethiopia. It tells of a goat named Kayalde. One day, Kayalde noticed his goats were behaving very strangely. They were frolicking, bleating, and practically dancing on their hind legs, filled with an energy he had never seen before. He traced their strange behavior to a small shrub with bright red berries, which the goats had been eagerly munching on. Curious, and perhaps a little bored, Kayalde tried a few berries himself. He soon felt a similar wave of exhilarating energy wash over him. He felt so alert, so alive, that he ran to a nearby monastery to share his discovery with the head monk. The monk was unimpressed, dismissing the berries as the devil's work, and threw them into the fire. But then, a wonderful thing happened. As the berries roasted in the flames, they released that very same intoxicating aroma you're smelling right now. The other monks, drawn by the scent, came to investigate. They raked the roasted beans from the embers, ground them up, and, thinking it might work better, dissolved them in hot water. That night, they all drank the brew and found they could stay awake for their long hours of prayer with ease. The dancing goats and the disapproving monk had, by complete accident, invented roasted coffee. Now is the story of Gaoldi and his hyperactive goats true? Almost certainly not. But historians are still in a gentle tug-of-war over coffee's true birthplace. The legend of Gaoldi points to Ethiopia, and there's strong botanical evidence that the coffee arabica plant is indeed native to that region. The Oromo people of Ethiopia have a long history of grinding coffee cherries and mixing them with fat to create snack balls for energy on long journeys, a practice that likely predates brewing. So, did the Ethiopians discover the plant's properties, only for the Yemenis across the sea to perfect the method of roasting and brewing it into a drink? That's the most likely scenario, a collaborative, cross-cultural invention story, even if the participants didn't know it. From the Sufi monasteries in Yemen, Tuwa began its slow migration. Pilgrims traveling to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina carried the knowledge and the beings with them. It quickly became popular there, moving from the religious sphere to the public one. From there, traders and travelers carried it to the great intellectual and commercial hub of Cairo, and then north to the ancient cities of Damascus and Aleppo. By the time those two Syrian merchants you heard about decided to open a shop in Istanbul, they weren't taking a wild gamble. They were importing a well-established cultural phenomenon from the major cities of the Arab world into the heart of the Ottoman Empire. So as you stand here, taking in this final breath of fragrant air before stepping inside, you understand. The aroma wafting from that doorway is not just a simple smell. It's the scent of Sufi prayers, of legendary dancing goats, of bustling trade routes and the collective energy of 100,000 conversations that have already taken place in other cities. This isn't just a shop. It's the destination at the end of a very long road. The low hum you hear from within is the sound of this new energy finally taking root in the capital of the world. Your hesitation fades. It's time to see it for yourself. You take a small, hesitant step forward, crossing the invisible line that separates the cool night air from the warmth of the room. The wooden door, heavy and dark with age, is already ajar, a silent invitation. You push it open just enough to slip inside, and for a moment, you just stand there, letting your senses adjust. The change in atmosphere is immediate and overwhelming. It's like stepping into a different world. The first thing that hits you is the warmth. It's not the oppressive, humid heat of the city in summer, but a dry, cozy warmth that emanates from a large brick hearth at the far end of the room. The second is the smell, now much more intense. That rich, roasted aroma of coffee is the dominant note, but it's layered with other scents. The sweet, slightly acrid smell of tobacco smoke from a few long-stemmed pipes. The faint, lingering fragrance of spices clinging to men's clothes from their day's work in the bazaar. And the simple, human smell of a room full of bodies. The third thing is the sound. That low hum you heard from outside now resolves into individual strands of quiet conversation. The gentle clinking of porcelain cups on ceramic saucers, the soft bubbling of water from the hearth, and the almost inaudible hiss of embers. The room is larger than you expected from the outside, but it feels intimate and close. The ceiling is low, supported by thick, dark wooden beams, and the walls are simple, whitewashed plaster, already beginning to stain a warm, smoky ochre. The light is dim, sorts from a few oil lamps hanging from the beams and the flickering glow of the fire. It's a soft, forgiving light that casts deep shadows in the corners of the room and makes faces appear thoughtful and serious. There are no tables and chairs in the modern sense. Instead, the space is lined with raised wooden platforms, or CDIR, covered with kilims heavy, woven rugs and deep reds and blues. Men are seated on these platforms, lounging on piles of cushions, their shoes left neatly on the floor below. You slip your own shoes off, following the custom, and find a small, unoccupied space on one of the platforms. You sink onto a cushion, the woven wool slightly coarse against your clothes. This is where you first notice the sheer variety of people in the room. This is the core, revolutionary concept of the coffeehouse. In the rigid, hierarchical society of the 16th century Ottoman Empire, different social classes simply did not mix in public. A government official would not socialize with a craftsman. A scholar of Islamic law would not share a space with a common soldier. Yet here they are. In one corner, you see a group of Janissaries. You can tell by their proud bearing, their meticulously groomed mustaches, and the distinctive white felt caps, the butt some have placed beside them. They're not in uniform, but they carry themselves with an air of unshakable confidence. They are the Sultan's elite fighting force, the most powerful military unit in the empire, and their presence here is significant. They are speaking in low, serious tones, perhaps discussing barracks politics or news from the frontier. Near them, a well-dressed man with a neat, graying beard and fine silk robes is engrossed in a game of chess with a younger man. His student, perhaps. He looks like a qadi, a judge, or maybe an ulama, a religious scholar. His fingers, stained with ink, hover over a carved ivory chess piece. Across the room, a cluster of merchants, their faces weathered from travel, are comparing notes, their conversation punctuated by gestures and quiet laughter. They are the lifeblood of the city, men who have seen Alexandria, Venice, and Persia. And scattered amongst them all are the ordinary men of Istanbul, artisans, shopkeepers, clerks, and poets with worn-out clothes and eyes full of dreams. This is a point that historians, like the scholar Simul K.A. Fedar, emphasize heavily. The coffeehouse created a new kind of public sphere that had never existed before. It was a neutral ground where social status was, for a moment, suspended. Your rank, your wealth, your profession, they mattered less here than the quality of your conversation or your skill at backgammon. That was small, but fascinating. Side note on the decor. Look closely at the walls. Between the hanging lamps, you might see small, framed pieces of calligraphy. This isn't just decoration. It's a reflection of the culture. The Ottoman elite prized calligraphy as the highest form of art. But there's a specific type you might find here, something a bit less formal. Historians debate how widespread this practice was initially, but some coffeehouses became places to display the work of aspiring calligraphers, or even witty, poetic verses composed on the spot by the patrons. It's a bit like a modern-day cafe pinning up local artists' work or having an open mic night. It shows that this was a space not just for consumption, but for creation. You feel a presence beside you. A young boy, no older than 12, with quick, dark eyes, has approached you silently. He is the Coffeehouse crack, the coffee maker's apprentice. He holds a small tray and asks you a question with his eyes. You don't speak the language, but you know what he's asking. You give a simple, slow nod. An order has been placed. You watch as he pads silently back towards the hearth, a small, efficient ghost in this warm, touching world. The murmur of conversation swells and recedes around you like a gentle tide. You're not a customer anymore. You're a part of the room, and you're about to have your first cup. As you settle into your cushion, feeling the initial awkwardness of being a newcomer start to melt away into the general warmth of the room, you begin to truly appreciate what you're witnessing. It's not just a diverse group of people. It's a living, breathing organism of information exchange. Before this moment, before the Coffeehouse, where would these men have shared news? They might have gathered in the courtyard of a mosque after prayers, but conversation there would be pious and subdued. They could have met in the Grand Bazaar, but the focus there was commerce, shouted over the din of 1,000 transactions. The wealthy had their private mansions, the poor had their homes. There was no common ground. And then this place appeared. This simple room, fueled by an non-alcoholic, mind-sharpening beverage, accidentally created the perfect environment for something new to grow. The Ottoman authorities were quick to notice this. They gave the coffeehouses a nickname, one that was a mixture of admiration and suspicion. MEKT, DBI Irfan. It translates to schools of knowledge or schools of the wise. On the surface, it's a compliment. It acknowledges that these were places of learning, debate, and intellectual exercise. Men would come here to read newly published books of poetry, to discuss philosophy, or to listen to news brought by travelers from distant corners of the empire. A merchant just back from Cairo could share first-hand accounts of the political situation in Egypt. A soldier returning from the Hungarian frontier could describe the latest military campaigns. It was the 16th century version of a 24-hour news channel, a live podcast, and a political firm all rolled into one. But the name schools of the wise also carried a subtle, sardonic edge, especially when used by the Sultan's advisors. A school without a state-sanctioned teacher, without a curriculum, without any oversight. That was a dangerous idea. It implied that men could educate themselves, form their own opinions, and draw their own conclusions, all outside the carefully controlled structures of the mosque and the palace. And that was exactly what was happening. The coffeehouse democratized information. A royal decree that was once proclaimed by a town crier and then faded into memory could now be dissected, debated, and criticized for hours by ordinary men over a cup of coffee. The Sultan's policies, once remote and unassailable, were suddenly being held up to the light and scrutinized by his subjects. You can see it happening right in front of you. A little further down your platform, a man is reading from a piece of paper. His voice isn't loud, but it's clear and steady, and a small circle of men has leaned in to listen. He could be reading a new poem from a popular author, or perhaps a letter from a friend in another city. Or, more tantalizingly, he could be reading one of the handwritten newsletters that were beginning to circulate. This is a fascinating bit of history that many people don't know about. Long before printed newspapers, there were people who made a living by gathering news and gossip, handwriting it onto sheets of paper, and distributing it. Coffeehouses were their primary distribution points. For the price of a coffee, you could learn about a new tax, a scandal in the court, or the price of wheat in Anatolia. This brings us to a really interesting, and still debated, academic question. Just how literate was the population of 16th century Istanbul? The traditional view holds that literacy was quite low, confined mostly to the religious, administrative, and mercantile elites. If that's the case, then in a scene like the one you're rewatching, there would be one literate person reading aloud to a group of 10 or 20 who were not. The coffeehouse, in this model, becomes a vital bridge, allowing the written word to reach the illiterate masses through performance. However, some modern historians challenge this view. They argue that literacy, at least the basic, functional literacy, might have been more widespread than we assume, especially in a bustling urban center like Istanbul. They point to the sheer volume of written material petitions to the court, guild records, commercial contracts as evidence. If this latter view is correct, then the man reading isn't just a conduit. He's more like a discussion leader. The men around him might not all have a copy of the text, but many of them could read it if they did. The debate is ongoing, relying on piecing together subtle clues from a time before census data. But, by the way you look at it, the coffeehouse was amplifying the power of the written word in an unprecedented way. The boy who took your order is now making his way back towards you, navigating the crowded room with a practiced grace. It's just not carrying your coffee yet. Instead, he places a small glass of cool water in front of you. This is the first step, a small but important ritual. It's meant to cleanse your palate, to prepare your mouth for the taste of the coffee. It's also a gesture of hospitality. You take a sip. The water is fresh and clean, a moment of simple clarity before the main event. You look around the room again, at the faces illuminated by the soft lamplight. Scholars, soldiers, merchants, artisans. They came from different worlds, but they have all gathered here, in this school of the wise, to participate in the grand, chaotic, and utterly human curriculum of the city. Your palate is cleansed, the cool water a pleasant memory. Now, your attention is drawn back to the source of all this activity, the hearth. It's not just a fireplace for warmth. It's the stage for a meticulous performance. This is where the magic happens, and you have a perfect vantage point to watch the Coffeehouse, the coffee master, at his craft. He is a man in his prime, with strong hands and a focused, almost reverent expression. He moves with an economy of motion that speaks of thousands of repetitions. Making coffee, he isn't about pushing a button on a machine. It's a ritual. First, the beans. He takes a small, long-handled pan, almost like a ladle with a flat bottom, and scoops up a measure of green coffee beans from a large sack. These aren't the uniform, perfectly roasted brown beans you're used to. They are pale, greenish-gray, and smell faintly of vegetation. Roasting is done on site, to order. This is a crucial detail that defines the taste. He holds the pan over the glowing embers of the hearth, shaking it constantly with a gentle, circular motion. The beans begin to shift in color, from green to a pale yellow, then to a warm cinnamon brown. A soft crackling sound, known as the first crack, fills the air as moisture escapes the beans. He listens intently, his ear trained to the sound as much as his eye is to the color. He continues roasting, the beans darkening further, their surfaces becoming oily and shiny. He is aiming for a very dark, almost black roast, typical for Turkish coffee. The rich, smoky aroma intensifies, filling the room. This is freshness on a level that is impossible to find in the modern world, short of roasting the beans yourself. Once he deems the roast perfect, he tips the hot beans into a large wooden mortar. He waits a moment for them to cool slightly before taking up a heavy wooden pestle, and then begins the rhythm of the coffeehouse. A steady, percussive thump thump thump. The grinding is done by hand, and the goal is to create a powder as fine as flour. This is not the coarse grind for a drip machine or a French press. It needs to be an impalpable dust. This fine grind is the secret to the unique body and texture of the coffee you're about to drink. Now for the brewing. He takes a small, beautiful object called a CEV or an eye brick. It's a tiny pot with a wide bottom, a narrow neck, and a long handle, traditionally made of copper or brass that gleams in the firelight. He measures the superfine coffee powder into the CEV, adds sugar if the customer requested it you didn't, so yours will be safe, or plain, and then adds cold water. He gives it a quick stir to combine everything and then places the CEV directly on the hot embers at the edge of the hearth. He watches it like a hawk. The process is quick and requires precise attention. As the water heats, the dark, thick foam begins to rise. This foam, or Topkapi, is the most prized part of the coffee. A good coffee master is judged by the quality of his foam. Just before the coffee boils over, he lifts the CEV from the heat, lets the foam subside slightly, and then places it back. He might do this 2 or 3 times. Historians and coffee connoisseurs still debate the correct number of rises, with some historical sources mentioning one method, while oral traditions passed down through families might insist on another. It's a classic example of a living tradition where the codified right way is always in flux. Finally, with a last, careful lift from the heat, the ritual is complete. He lets the pot sit for a few seconds to allow the grounds to settle. Then, he pours. The pour itself is an art. He tilts the CEV slowly, carefully, ensuring that a little bit of that precious foam makes it into each cup. The boy apprentice is there with his tray, and your small, handleless porcelain cup, a fincan, is filled with the dark, viscous liquid. The boy brings it over to you. The cup sits in a small metal holder, an elegant solution to the problem of holding the hot porcelain. The coffee is almost black, and on its surface sits a perfect, unbroken layer of creamy, hazelnut-colored foam. You are meant to drink it slowly, to sip it. This is not a drink to be chugged down for a caffeine hit. It's an experience to be savored. You raise the small cup. The aroma is now overwhelming, smoky, earthy, intense. You take your first, small sip. The liquid is thick, almost syrupy, and the taste is powerful. It's bitter, yes, but it's a complex, deep bitterness, with none of the harsh acidity of poorly made modern coffee. Because it was brewed with the grounds, the texture is slightly gritty, which might be off-putting to a modern palate, but is considered an essential part of the experience here. A fine powder continues to settle at the bottom of the cup as you drink. This leads to a fun, niche practice: coffee fortune-telling, or tassography. After you finish the coffee, you're supposed to turn the cup upside down on its saucer and let it cool. The thick, muddy grounds that remain at the bottom will slide down the sides of the cup, creating patterns. A skilled fortune teller, often an older woman, though men in coffeehouses were known to do it for fun, would then read these patterns, predicting your future. It was a game, a form of entertainment, but it shows how deeply this drink integrated itself into the culture, becoming a medium not just for news and politics, but for superstition and play. You look at the dark liquid in your cup. It's not just a beverage. It's a performance, a tradition, and maybe, just maybe, a glimpse into your future. As the potent, unfamiliar taste of the coffee settles on your tongue, you feel a subtle shift in your own perception. Your senses seem to sharpen. The low murmur of the room, which was just background noise a moment ago, now seems clearer, more distinct. You can pick out individual conversations, snippets of lives intersecting in this shared space. This heightened alertness is precisely what made the drink so popular, and it's what transformed these rooms from simple cafes into nerve centers of the city. You are now sitting in the original social network, a living, breathing web of information. The conversation ebbs and flows around you. A few feet away, two men in the simple woolen robes of artisans are complaining about the head of their guild. They speak in low, cautious tones, but their grievances are clear. A new fee has been levied, a decision made without consulting the members. In another corner, a group of merchants are engaged in a more animated discussion. One has just returned from Venice, and HES describing the city's impressive naval arsenal. The arsenal, he speaks of the size of the ships, the efficiency of their construction. This isn't just idle chatter. For the Ottoman state, perpetually in a state of naval competition with Venice, this is valuable intelligence. The man sitting next to him, a rug merchant, listens intently. He might pass this information on to a government contact later, or simply use it to inform his own business decisions. Information is currency here, as valuable as the silver coins in their purses. This is the most well-known function of the coffeehouse. It was a hub for news and gossip, a place where information, both trivial and vital, was exchanged with astonishing speed. Before the coffeehouse, news traveled at the speed of an official decree or a slow-moving caravan. Now it traveled at the speed of a conversation. A rumor that started in the Sultan's palace in the morning could be the talk of a coffeehouse in Topkapi by evening, passed from a palace guard to his brother, who told the shopkeeper, who sat next to you. You lean back slightly, trying to be inconspicuous, and listen to a conversation happening just behind you. The men are discussing the Janissaries, the elite soldiers you saw earlier. There are whispers about their growing influence, their demands for more pay, their simmering resentments. One man mutters that they are becoming a state within a state. This is seditious talk. If these words were overheard by the wrong person, they could lead to arrest, or worse. But in the relative anonymity and safety of the crowded coffee house, under the cover of the general hum, such dangerous thoughts could be spoken aloud. The coffee house provided a stage for public opinion to form and solidify. And then there's the gossip, the fuel that keeps the social engine running. You overhear a fragment of a story about a vizier's wife and a secret affair. A joke about a notoriously stingy religious official. A tale of a merchant who tried to pass off shoddy goods in the bazaar and was publicly shamed. This wasn't just malicious fun. It was a form of social regulation. Reputations were made and broken in these rooms. The fear of being the subject of coffeehouse gossip could be a powerful motivator for individuals to adhere to social norms. This brings us to a peculiar and often overlooked aspect of this information ecosystem: the deliberate spread of misinformation. Because coffeehouses were such effective amplifiers, they could also be used to plant false rumors. A government official wanting to gauge public reaction to a potential new tax might leak a rumor about it in a coffeehouse and see what the blowback was like. A merchant looking to corner the market on a certain spice might start a false rumor that the latest shipment was lost at sea, hoping to drive up prices. Historians are still trying to piece together specific instances of this, and it's a subject of much debate. How do you find archival proof of a deliberately planted lie from 450 years ago? It's incredibly difficult, but the consensus is that it was certainly happening. The coffee house was not just a school of the wise. It was also a school of the cunning. You notice a man moving quietly through the room. He is not a customer. He doesn't order a coffee or take a seat. He drifts from group to group, his ears open, his expression neutral. He might be an agent of the Grand Vizier, a spy for the Qadi, or even a private informant paid by a wealthy merchant. The authorities were well aware of the coffeehouse's power, and they made efforts to monitor what was being said. The presence of these spies, or the fear of their presence, added a layer of thrilling paranoia to the proceedings. People learned to speak in coded language, to use allusions on metaphors when discussing sensitive topics. It turned political discourse into a kind of poetry, full of double meanings and subtle winks. You take another sip of your coffee. The thick, dark liquid seems to hold all the city's secrets. The man reading the newsletter has finished, and now the men around him are arguing, dissecting what he read, adding their own information, their own spin. The room is a testament to the insatiable human thirst for knowledge, for connection, for knowing what's going on. In this dimly lit room, over this bitter black drink, a new form of power is being forged. The power of a will informed, and sometimes misinformed, public. Just as you're starting to feel like you got a handle on the rhythm of the place, the low hum of politics, the sharp bursts of gossip, the energy in the room shifts. A man has stood up near the hearth, and he isn't one of the staff. A GS of middling age, with a weary frame and an expressive face that seems to hold 1,000 stories. He claps his hands together once, the sharp, clean sound that cuts through the murmur. The conversations don't stop, but they lower in volume. Heads turn. A sense of anticipation ripples through the room. This is the Meddo, the public storyteller. The coffee house wasn't just a place for news and debate. It was a theater, and the Meddo was its star performer. He is a walking, talking library of folklore, history, and romance. For the price of a few coins dropped into a collection basket, or sometimes just for the goodwill of the owner who knows he draws a crowd, he will transport his audience to another world. He carries no props, save for a simple wooden staff in one hand and a handkerchief in the other. His stage is just slightly raised to lure a small patch of open floor. His entire art form rests on the power of his voice, his gestures, and the imagination of his listeners. He begins. His voice is calm at first, drawing you in. She is telling a familiar tale, perhaps a story from the Shahnameh, the Persian Book of Kings, or a romantic legend of Layla and Majnun. But he doesn't just recite it. He embodies it. He uses his staff to become a sword, a horse, a king's scepter, or a hermit's walking stick. He dabs his brow with a handkerchief to show exertion, wipes a tear to show sorrow, or snaps it open to represent a letter being unfurled. His voice changes, shifting from the booming commands of a sultan to the whispered plea of a lover, from the cackle of a witch to the innocent babble of a child. He becomes all the characters. The room is silent now, captivated. The men who were arguing about guild politics a moment ago are now leaning forward, their eyes wide, lost in a mythical battle. This is a mainstream, well-documented feature of coffeehouse culture. The Medda was a respected and essential figure, a professional entertainer in an age before mass media. They were the inheritors of an ancient old tradition, and coffeehouses provided them with the perfect, ready-made audience. Their stories weren't just simple entertainment, though. They often contained subtle moral lessons, social commentary, and even political satire, cleverly disguised within the layers of a historical epic or a funny folk tale. A story about a foolish and arrogant king from 1,000 years ago might sound suspiciously like a commentary on the current sultan. It was a safe way to be subversive, to criticize the powerful by cloaking the critique in the respectable robes of tradition. But here's a more niche, fascinating detail about the Medda tradition. They were masters of the cliffhanger. A talented storyteller wouldn't just tell one complete story and then stop. He would often serialize his epics. He would spin a tale for an hour or so, building the suspense, getting to the most exciting part. The hero is hanging from a cliff. The princess is about to be discovered in her hiding place, and then he would stop. He'd look around the room and say something like, "What happens next? Only God knows, and I will. Tomorrow night, if you're all here to listen." It was a brilliant business tactic. It ensured a returning audience, not just for him, but for the coffeehouse owner. It turned the story into a subscription service, the 16th century equivalent of a binge-worthy TV show that drops one episode a week. The academic debate surrounding the Medda is a subtle one. To what extent were they independent artists, and to what extent were they mouthpieces for the state or other powerful interests? The traditional view sees them as folk artists, guardians of popular culture, but some historians argue that the state likely co-opted the most popular Meddas, subtly encouraging them to tell stories that reinforced imperial ideology, tales of glorious Ottoman victories, or just impious sultans of the past. It's likely the truth is somewhere in the middle. The most successful storytellers were probably adept at walking a fine line, telling stories that pleased the crowd, flattered the authorities, and still contained their own clever, hidden bombs of commentary. They were masters of ambiguity. The Medda is reaching the climax of a scene. He is portraying a frantic chase on horseback. His body rocks back and forth on his stool. His staff becomes a whip, and he makes the sound of galloping hooves with a series of clicks and stomps. HES, a one-man sound effects department. The illusion is so complete that you can almost feel the wind and see the dust. The men around you are completely engrossed. Their coffee sits forgotten, growing cold. This is a shared communal experience, a moment of collective dreaming. You look around the room. The Janissary, the judge, the merchant, the baker, all their social distinctions have vanished. They are no longer men of different classes and professions. They are simply an audience, united in their focus on the story. This is another layer of the coffeehouse's magic. It didn't just break down social barriers for conversation. It broke them down for entertainment and wonder. In this moment, the storyteller is the most important man in Istanbul, and this simple room, full of smoke and the smell of coffee, has become the grandest theater in the world. The storyteller's voice fades, leaving a cliffhanger hanging in the air like a puff of pipe smoke. He bows, collects his coins, and melts back into the crowd, the spell broken. The hum of conversation slowly returns, but the energy in the room has changed. It's later now. Outside, the city is truly asleep. save for the watchmen on their lonely patrols. But inside the coffee house, the night is still young, and the entertainment is about to enter its next phase. One of the apprentices brings out a large, white sheet and hangs it across a corner of the room, creating a makeshift screen. He places an oil lamp behind it, creating a luminous, glowing canvas. The lights in the rest of the room are dimmed even further. The stage is set for Karagöz v Hacivat. This is the famous Turkish shadow puppet theater, a form of entertainment that was raw, raucous, and incredibly popular. If the Meddo was the prestige drama, this was the slapstick comedy, the political cartoon brought to life. The puppets themselves are simple, two-dimensional figures made from treated camel or water buffalo hide, which makes them translucent. They are intricately cotton painted and controlled by long, thin rods. When held between the lamp and the screen, they spring into vibrant, colorful life. The show begins. The two main characters appear on the screen. First, there's Hacivat. He is the educated, pompous one. He speaks in a high-flown, poetic Ottoman Turkish, using big words and constantly trying to show off his superior learning and manners. He represents the pretentious, often out of touch, urban elite. Then comes Karagöz, bursting onto the scene. He is the opposite in every way. He is an uneducated, impulsive, and brutally honest man of the people. He is a trickster, a buffoon, and the voice of common sense. He constantly misunderstands Hacivat's fancy words, leading to hilarious and often risque puns and misunderstandings. Karagöz is always getting into trouble, looking for a get-rich-quick scheme, and isn't afraid to hit people with a stick. The puppeteer, known as the Hayali, is a master of voices, manipulating both puppets and speaking all the parts. The plot is usually simple. Hacivat will come up with some grand scheme, and Karagöz will bumble his way through it, exposing Hacivat's foolishness and usually getting them both a beating in the end. The audience roars with laughter. The humor is broad, physical, and often quite crude, full of jokes that would make a religious scholar blush. This was a key part of its appeal. It was a pressure valve, a place where all the frustrations of daily life could be laughed at. The historical origin of Karagöz and Hacivat is a classic, mainstream part of Ottoman cultural history. The legend goes that they were real people, construction workers on a mosque in Bursa in the 14th century. Karagöz was a blacksmith and Hacivat a stonemason. Their witty banter and constant jokes were so entertaining that they distracted all the other workers, slowing down the construction. When the Sultan heard about this, he had them executed. But he soon regretted his decision, and to console him, one of his courtiers made puppets of the two men and reenacted their funny dialogues behind a screen. The show was born from a story of martyrdom to comedy. But here's a much more niche detail. The supporting cast. While Karagöz and Hacivat are the stars, the plays featured a huge variety of stock characters who would pop in and out, representing the incredible diversity of the Ottoman Empire. There was Çelebi, a dapper young man about town. Tiyoki, a sleepy opium addict who was always mumbling. Baby Rohi, an excitable dwarf. And a whole host of ethnic and regional stereotypes. There was the land from the Black Sea coast who spoke in a fast, incomprehensible dialect. The Arab merchant who would get his proverbs mixed up. The clueless Persian. The swaggering Albanian security guard. Today, these characters would seem like a minefield of offensive stereotypes. But in the context of the 16th century, they were a way for this incredibly diverse, multi-ethnic empire to see itself, to laugh at its own internal prejudices and communication breakdowns. It was a bizarre, and perhaps problematic, form of cultural self-reflection. This leads to an ongoing academic debate. Was Karagöz and Hacivat primarily a form of social control, or a form of social resistance? The control argument suggests that by allowing the common people to laugh at stereotypes and at a bumbling everyman like Karagöz, the state was providing a harmless outlet for their frustrations. The plays reinforced the social order by making fun of those who tried to get above their station. The resistance argument, on the other hand, posits that Karagöz was a deeply subversive figure. His character was a constant thorn in the side of authority. He would mock the powerful, expose the hypocrisy of the learned, and always speak truth to power, even if it was by accident. Through the mouth of this illiterate puppet, the puppeteer could voice criticisms of the government that would be far too dangerous to say directly. Historians analyze the surviving scripts, many of which were written down much later, preserving an oral tradition to find evidence for both sides. The answer is likely that it was both, depending on the puppeteer, the audience, and the political climate of the day. On the screen in front of you, Karagöz has just mistaken Hacivat's poetic declaration of love for a shopping list. The room is shaking with laughter. You find yourself laughing along, even if you don't understand every word. The slapstick is universal. The light from the lamp flickers, making the shadows dance. For a moment, you forget where you are. You're not in a coffee house in Istanbul anymore. You are in the world of shadows, a world of pure, unadulterated fun, where a simple man with a good heart and a quick wit can always outsmart his supposed betters. The shadow puppets are packed away, and the lingering laughter slowly subsides, replaced once again by the familiar, low hum of conversation. The night has deepened. Many of the earlier patrons, the merchants, the artisans with early morning work, have paid their small coins and slipped out into the darkness. The crowd is thinner now, and the atmosphere has shifted. It feels more intimate, but also more charged. The men who remain are the night owls, the thinkers, the poets, and the politically minded. And with this shift, another, less tangible presence makes itself felt in the room. The weight of the Sultan's gaze. You don't see it, of course. There are no uniformed guards at the door, no overt signs of surveillance. But it's there. A slight caution in the way men lower their voices when a newcomer enters. A shared glance between friends when a particularly bold statement is made. Everyone in this room is aware that these schools of the wise are viewed with deep suspicion by the powers that be. The very existence of this space is a challenge to the absolute authority of the Sultan. In the Ottoman worldview, order, or nizam, was paramount. Society was meant to be a well-regulated machine, with every person in their designated place, performing their designated function. The Sultan was the heart of this machine, the ultimate authority appointed by God. Any gathering of men that occurred outside of the officially sanctioned spaces, the mosque, the guild hall, the military barracks, was inherently suspect, and the coffeehouse was the most suspect of them all. Why? Because it was uncontrollable. The authorities couldn't control who talked to whom. They couldn't control what was said. And most importantly, they couldn't control the conclusions people drew. They saw these places as breeding grounds for fitna, a powerful and resonant Arabic word that means sedition, social discord, or chaos. It's the opposite of nizam. A poet reciting a verse about the tyranny of a long-dead king could be planting dangerous ideas. A group of disgruntled soldiers complaining about their pay could be plotting a mutiny. In the eyes of the palace, the coffeehouse was a tinderbox of potential rebellion, and the coffee itself was the fuel. This wasn't just paranoia. The Sultan and his viziers had good reason to be wary. The history of Istanbul was rife with popular uprisings and military revolts, often led by the Janissaries you saw here earlier. These elite soldiers, while fiercely loyal on the battlefield, were also a powerful political force in the capital. They had deposed and even executed sultans before. The idea of them gathering in coffeehouses, mixing with the general populace, absorbing their grievances and adding their own, was a terrifying prospect for any ruler. The coffeehouse was a place where the anger of the barracks could meet the anger of the bazaar. This leads us to a specific, and rather unusual, historical event that showcases this suspicion. At one point, Sultan Murad IV, who ruled in the next century but whose policies were rooted in this earlier suspicion, took things a step further than mere surveillance. This is a strange little historical fact. He was known for walking the streets of Istanbul at night in disguise, a common practice for rulers wanting to gauge the mood of their people. He would enter coffeehouses, sit amongst his subjects, and listen to what they were saying about him and his policies. If he heard someone speaking ill of him, he would reveal himself and, according to some of the more dramatic accounts, sentence the man to death on the spot. While these tales might be exaggerated, they capture the very real tension that existed between the ruler and these new public spaces. The academic debate here is a fascinating one. Were the coffeehouses truly the hotbeds of revolutionary thought that the authorities feared? Or was this largely an overreaction, a case of an authoritarian state being afraid of its own shadow? The real threat school of thought points to the fact that many plots and rebellions were indeed linked to coffeehouse gatherings in the centuries that followed. They became natural meeting places for conspirators. The overreaction school, however, argues that for the vast majority of patrons, the coffeehouse was simply a place to relax, socialize, and be entertained. They argue that the state projected its own insecurities onto these establishments, seeing revolution in what was mostly just idle chatter. The historical record contains evidence for both sides. For every documented case of a coffeehouse Hacivat, there are thousands of unrecorded nights of simple, harmless conversation. The truth, as is so often the case, is probably a mix of both. You look around the thinned-out room. The man who was reading the newsletter earlier is now locked in a quiet but intense debate with the scholar-like gentleman who was playing chess. They are not angry. Their voices are measured, but their faces are serious. They are dissecting a point of law, or perhaps a philosophical question. In the corner, the remaining Janissaries are no longer talking about barracks politics. One of them is quietly reciting a poem, his eyes half closed. The words are about love and loss, not war and glory. The air is thick with thought. Even without understanding the language, you can feel the intellectual energy. This is what the Sultan feared. Not necessarily open rebellion, but the simple, quiet act of men thinking for themselves. The coffee, that strange black brew, didn't just keep them awake. It woke them up. And for a ruler who demanded unquestioning obedience, a populace that was wide awake was the most dangerous thing of all. While the Sultan and his viziers were wringing their hands about fitna and sedition, the two Syrian merchants who reportedly started all this, Hakim of Aleppo and Jums of Damascus, were probably focused on something far more practical: running a successful business. Because beneath all the layers of culture, politics, and social revolution, the coffeehouse was, at its heart, a commercial enterprise. It was a new business model in a city that was the global capital of commerce, and it turned out to be an incredibly profitable one. Let's put you in the shoes of a prospective coffeehouse owner for a moment. You've seen how popular these places are, and you've decided you want in on the action. What do you need to do? First, location. Topkapi, where you are now, was the perfect starting point. It was right next to the Grand Bazaar and the Spice Bazaar, meaning it had constant, heavy foot traffic from all corners of the empire and beyond. It was a dense, commercial district where news and money flowed in equal measure. Choosing a spot on a busy street corner here was a recipe for success. Next, you need your key supplies. That means coffee beans, and that's a major expense. You'd have to source them from merchants who brought them from Yemen, via Cairo or Damascus. You'd also need sugar, which was another expensive import. You'd need a good supply of charcoal for the hearth, and a potter to make your fincans and a coppersmith to craft your beautiful CEZGES. And most importantly, you need a skilled coffee CI, the coffee master. This wasn't a job you could give to just anyone. As you've seen, it required skill, precision, and a bit of showmanship. A coffeehouse with a master who made excellent foam would quickly gain a reputation and draw customers away from his less skilled rivals. Then comes the interior design. We've talked about the CDIR, the raised platforms with their kilns and cushions. This was the standard layout. It was comfortable, space-efficient, and encouraged a communal atmosphere. You wouldn't have individual tables like a modern cafe, because that would isolate customers. The goal was to get people to mix and mingle. You'd need good lighting, enough oil lamps to keep the place from feeling gloomy, but not so many that it lost its intimate, cozy feel. And you would need entertainment. Hiring a Meadow or a Karagöz Ipapatier was an investment. They would cost you money, but their presence would pack the house and sell a lot more coffee. It's the same reason a modern bar has a live band or a big screen TV. This is the standard historical picture of what it took to run a coffeehouse. But here's a more unusual and very practical consideration. Water. Istanbul had a complex and sophisticated system of aqueducts, fountains, and cisterns, but access to clean water was still a major factor in daily life. A coffeehouse, which used water not just for brewing, but also for constantly washing the little cups and for the palate cleansing glasses served to each customer, needed a reliable source of good water. Historians who study the urban infrastructure of the city have noted that the most successful early coffeehouses were often located very close to public fountains, sets more the water distribution points of major mosque complexes. It seems like an obvious point, but it's a small, logistical detail that would have been the difference between success and failure. You can't sell coffee if you don't have clean water. Now, let's talk about the business model itself. It was brilliant in its simplicity. The price of a cup of coffee was very low, just a few x the small silver coin of the time. It was affordable for almost everyone, from a common laborer to a wealthy official. This low barrier to entry was key to its democratic appeal. You didn't make your money by selling one expensive item to a rich person. You made it by selling a very cheap item to hundreds of people over the course of a long day. The coffeehouse was a high-volume, low-margin business. But were they really low-margin? This is a point of some academic contention. The price of the coffee cup was low, yes, but the raw ingredients, especially the coffee beans themselves, were imported and could be quite expensive. How did the owners make such a good profit? Some historians argue that the real profit wasn't from the coffee itself, but from the rent of the space. People would buy 1 or 2 cheap cups of coffee, but then sit for hours, talking, playing games, and listening to stories. The coffee was the price of admission to this warm, comfortable, entertaining social club. Others argue that owners likely had other, unrecorded streams of income, perhaps taking a small cut from the storyteller's collection, or facilitating small-scale money lending, or even charging a premium for the use of a backgammon set. The exact economics are hard to reconstruct, but we know from court records and official complaints that coffeehouse owners became wealthy very quickly, which suggests the business was far more lucrative than it appeared on the surface. You watch the apprentice as he moves through the room, collecting empty cups. He's fast and efficient. The owner, a stout man with a shrewd look in his eye, stands near the entrance, greeting a late-night arrival with a warm but professional smile. He's not just selling a drink. He's selling atmosphere, community, information, and entertainment. He has taken a bitter bean from a faraway and turned it into one of the most successful and disruptive business models the city has ever seen. The Sultan may see a room full of rebels, but the owner sees a room full of paying customers. And in the bustling, capitalist heart of 16th century Istanbul, the owner's view was the one that was quickly changing the face of the city. You take another slow sip of your coffee. The dark, rich liquid is stark contrast to the cool water you had earlier. The taste is growing on you. As you sit here, in the heart of the Ottoman capital, it's easy to think of this coffee as an Istanbul phenomenon. But the journey of the beans that ended up as fine powder in your cup is a story of international trade, long-distance travel, and immense risk. It's a story that starts hundreds of miles to the south, in a place that held a global monopoly on a precious commodity. Let's trace that journey backward. Before the beans were roasted by the Coffeehouse at the hearth, before they were ground in the mortar, they were stored in large burlap sacks in the back of this very coffee house. Before that, they were unloaded from a ship at the docks of the Golden Horn, having sailed across the Mediterranean from Alexandria in Egypt. And before that, they were carried by a camel caravan across the Sinai Desert to Alexandria, having been sailed up the Red Sea from a single, legendary port. That port was Mocha, in Yemen. For a long time, Yemen was the world's sole exporter of coffee. The rulers of Yemen and the merchants of Mocha were acutely aware of the value of their unique crop. They guarded it jealously. To protect their monopoly, they forbade the export of any fertile coffee beans or live coffee plants. All beans that were to be either boiled or partially roasted to ensure they couldn't be germinated. This is the mainstream historical account of how Yemen cornered the coffee market for over a century. The port of Mocha became so synonymous with the coffee trade that its name would eventually become a descriptor for a type of coffee, a legacy that endures to this day. The journey from the Yemeni highlands, where the coffee was grown, to the port of Mocha, and then on to the rest of the world, was treacherous. The beans were transported by camel, a slow and arduous process. At the port, they were loaded onto ships that had to navigate the pirate-infested waters of the Red Sea. From the port of Suez in Egypt, they were loaded back onto camels for the overland trek to the Nile, then loaded onto riverboats to be taken to Alexandria, where Venetian and other European merchants, as well as Ottoman raiders, would be waiting. Every step of this journey added to the cost. By the time a sack of coffee beans reached a merchant in Istanbul, its price had been inflated tenfold by taxes, transport costs, and the profits of a dozen middlemen. This is why, despite the low price of a single cup, coffee was still a luxury good in the grand scheme of things. Now for a wonderfully niche piece of this story, a tale of smuggling and industrial espionage that would change the world. The Yemeni monopoly was bound to be challenged. The demand for coffee was simply too high. That hero, or villain, of this story is an Indian Sufi saint named Baba Buddha. The legend goes that in the 17th century, while on a pilgrimage to Mecca, Baba Buddha traveled through Yemen and tasted coffee for the first time. He was amazed by the drink and saw its potential. Knowing that he couldn't legally take any fertile beans out of the country, he devised a clever plan. He strapped 7 coffee beans to his chest, hiding them under his clothes. The number 7 is considered sacred in Islam, adding a layer of mystique to the story. He managed to pass through the port of Mocha without being discovered and returned to his home in the hills of Chikmagalur in southern India. There, he planted the 7 beans, and they grew. These 7 beans are said to be the ancestors of all the coffee that would eventually be grown in India and, later, in other parts of Asia. Is the story of Baba Buddha and his 7 beans literally true? It's hard to say. It's a foundational myth for the Indian coffee industry. But historians are in a constant debate about how exactly the coffee plant spread. Was it a single act of smuggling like the Baba Buddha story? Or was it a more gradual process, with multiple small-scale smugglers and traders successfully sneaking out a few beans here and there over many years? The Dutch certainly played a major role later on, acquiring some plants through means they were never keen to publicize and starting vast plantations in their colonies in Java and Sumatra. This is what ultimately broke the Yemeni monopoly and made coffee a truly global commodity. The great man theory of history loves the Baba Buddha story because it's clean and heroic. But the more likely, if less romantic, truth is a messier story of many people seeking to break a lucrative monopoly. Back in your coffee house, the implications of this global trade are around you. The man you identified as a Venetian merchant earlier is deep in conversation with a local spice trader. They are probably haggling over prices, their conversation a mix of Italian, Turkish, and Arabic, the lingua franca of Mediterranean trade. The Venetian isn't just here for pleasure. He's here for business. He sees the coffee house not just as a cultural oddity, but as a model he can export. He is taking notes, consciously or not, on the layout, the service, the entire experience. The cup in your hand represents the pinnacle of a long and expensive supply chain. Its journey connects the terraced farms of Yemen, the holy sites of Mecca, the bustling ports of the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, the camel caravans of the desert, and finally, this dimly lit room in Istanbul. It's a testament to the power of a single plant to create global networks of trade, diplomacy, and intrigue. The bitterness in the coffee is not just the taste of the roast. It's the taste of the desert, the salt of the sea, and the immense human effort it took to bring it to your lips. As you continue to sip your coffee, you feel its effects more keenly. It's not a jittery, nervous energy. Instead, it's a feeling of serene focus, a calm alertness. Your thoughts feel clear, more organized. To you, this is a familiar sensation. But in the 16th century, this powerful psychopative effect on the human body and mind was a source of profound confusion, wonder, and intense debate. Before it could become a beloved social ritual, coffee had to survive a trial by fire, scrutinized by the two most powerful intellectual forces of the age, religion and medicine. The moment coffee left the secluded Sufi monasteries and entered the public sphere in cities like Mecca and Cairo, it triggered a fierce religious backlash. Conservative religious scholars and jurists were deeply suspicious of this new drink. Their primary concern was whether it was an intoxicant, making it haram, or forbidden, like alcohol. The Quran is explicit in its prohibition of wine khamar, and by extension, all intoxicants that crowd the mind. So, the central question became, does coffee intoxicate? This sparked what are now known as the coffee debates. The arguments were passionate and often public. Those against coffee claimed that it did indeed have intoxicating properties. They pointed to the feeling of euphoria and the changes in mood that drinkers experienced. They argued that people were gathering in coffee houses for frivolous purposes, neglecting their religious duties, and that these places were dens of vice, gambling, and illicit talk. In Mecca, around 1511, a powerful conservative official named Karagöz managed to temporarily ban coffee, raiding and shutting down the city's coffee houses, claiming they were as bad as wine taverns. This is a well-documented historical event, one of the first major legal challenges coffee faced. On the other side, proponents of coffee mounted a spirited defense. They argued that coffee did the exact opposite of intoxicating. It didn't cloud the mind. It sharpened it. It didn't lead to drunken stuporess. It led to wakefulness and clarity, which could aid in late-night study of the Quran and other religious texts. They brought forth doctors to testify to its effects. They argued that any intoxication was merely a feeling of well-being and energy, not a loss of control. The ban in Mecca was eventually overturned by the Sultan in Cairo, who was reportedly a coffee drinker himself, but the argument was far from settled. This same debate would erupt again and again, in Cairo, in Damascus, and, of course, here in Istanbul. Parallel to the religious debate was a medical one. Doctors and physicians of the era, working within the framework of Galenic medicine based on the four humors, black bile, yellow bile, sewer, and blood, tried to understand what this strange substance was doing to the body. What were its properties? Was it hot or cold? Dry or moist? This was the essential diagnostic framework they used for everything. And this is a wonderfully weird and niche part of the story. The initial medical consensus, based on the theories of famous medieval physicians like Avicenna, was that coffee was cold and dry. They prescribed it to treat conditions caused by an excess of heat and moisture, such as lethargy and headaches. But this created a paradox. The observable effects of coffee, the increased energy, the feeling of warmth, the wake-up signals seemed to correspond to hot properties. So how could it be cold and dry? This led to a major medical controversy that historians of science loved to study. Doctors wrote competing treatises on the true nature of coffee. Some stuck to the old texts, arguing that its primary nature was cold, but it had a secondary hot effect. Others boldly broke with tradition, arguing that observation had to trump ancient theory, and declared coffee to be hot and dry. One physician argued it was hot in the first degree, while another claimed it was cold in the second. The debate seems bizarre to us now, but it was a serious scientific inquiry at the time. A clash between centuries-old textual authority and new, direct empirical evidence. The question of whether coffee was ultimately a medicine or a poison was never fully resolved. There are texts that praise it as a cure-all, claiming it could treat everything from kidney stones and measles to melancholy. One of the most common claims was that it was an excellent digestive aid, which is why it was often consumed after a heavy meal. Other texts, however, condemned it as a dangerous substance, blaming it for causing insomnia, anxiety, weight loss, and even impotence. One of the most common complaints was that it produced melancholy humors, essentially linking it to depression. This is a point where academic consensus is still evolving. For a long time, the narrative was that science eventually proved coffee's benefits. But more recent historical analysis suggests that the medical and religious arguments were never truly separate. The doctors who found coffee to be beneficial were often the same ones who enjoyed drinking it in coffeehouses with their intellectual friends. The doctors who condemned it were often allied with the conservative religious factions who opposed the coffeehouses on moral grounds. The scientific debate was, in many ways, a proxy war for the larger cultural battle over the coffeehouse itself. You look down at your cup, now half empty. Is this dark liquid in front of you a holy elixir, a forbidden intoxicant, a potent medicine, or a dangerous poison? In this room, in this century, it is all of these things at once. The debate rages outside these walls, in the mosques, in the courts, and in the physicians' studies. But in here, the verdict has already been cast by the patrons. They have weighed the arguments, they have felt the effects, and they have voted with their feet and their coins. For them, it is simply good. As the night wears on, a specific group of patrons becomes more noticeable, not by their noise, but by their quiet, confident presence. It's the Janissaries, the men you noticed when you first arrived. Some of the earlier group have left, but others have taken their place. They sit together, a tight-knit fraternity, their postures relaxed but alert. They are the Empire's sword and shield, the most formidable infantry force in the early modern world. And this place, the Coffeehouse, has become their unofficial clubhouse. The Janissaries were a unique and powerful institution within the Ottoman state. Originally formed in the 14th century, they were an elite corps of household troops and bodyguards directly loyal to the Sultan. Their most famous feature was their recruitment method, the Devsurmi system. This was essentially a human levy, where young Christian boys from the Balkan provinces of the empire were taken from their families, converted to Islam, and raised to be soldiers or administrators. Cut off from their biological families, their only loyalty was supposed to be to the Sultan and to their corps. This system produced a highly disciplined, professional, and fanatically loyal fighting force that was the terror of European armies for centuries. This is the standard, textbook history of who the Janissaries were. By the time you've arrived in this 16th century coffeehouse, however, the core has begun to change. They are still an elite fighting force, but they have also become deeply embedded in the economic and political life of Istanbul. Many Janissaries were not on active campaign. They were stationed in the capital, serving as garrison troops, city guards, and even firefighters. They had free time and disposable income. And like everyone else, they were drawn to the novelty and comfort of the coffee house. Here, they could escape the rigid discipline of their barracks. They could relax, socialize, and connect with the civilian world. They were immensely respected and feared by the general populace, and their presence conferred a certain prestige and a certain security on a coffee house. The owner of this establishment is likely thrilled to have them as regulars. Their patronage means his coffee house is safe from common thugs and that he has a powerful group of customers who pay their bills. But there's a more niche aspect to the Janissary presence here. It's not just about relaxation. For many of them, the coffee house became a place of business. By the 16th century, the rules had been relaxed to allow Janissaries to marry and engage in trade. Many of them became small-scale merchants or artisans in their off-duty hours to supplement their official pay. You might see a Janissary who owns a small grocery stall in the bazaar discussing supply prices with a merchant, or another who has invested in a shipment of textiles haggling over the details. The coffee house became a crucial link for them, connecting their military world to the commercial ecosystem of the city. It blurred the lines between soldier and citizen. This blurring of roles is at the heart of an ongoing historical debate. What was the primary identity of a Janissary in 16th century Istanbul? Was he a soldier first and foremost, a member of a privileged military caste? Or was he becoming more like a townsman with a military side job, an armed artisan, a member of the urban middle class who just happened to have elite military training? The traditional view emphasizes their military identity, seeing their commercial activities as a sign of the core decay and declining discipline. More recent scholarship, however, offers a more nuanced picture. It suggests that this dual identity was not a sign of weakness, but a source of strength and influence. By being deeply integrated into the city's economy, the Janissaries became indispensable not just on the battlefield, but in the daily life of the capital. Their power was not just military. It was economic and social. The coffee house is the perfect place to see this dual identity in action. You watch one of the Janissaries. HES not talking about war or politics. HES examining a small, intricately carved wooden box that a craftsman is showing him. He turns it over in his calloused hands, his brow furrowed in concentration. HES not a soldier in this moment. HES a customer, a potential investor, a man of commerce. Their presence also had a direct impact on the spread of coffeehouse culture. When Janissary garrisons were posted to other cities and frontier towns across the vast empire from Belgrade to Baghdad, from Budapest to Cairo, they took their new coffee-drinking habit with them. They would demand a local coffeehouse to relax in, or even start one themselves. In this way, the Janissaries became one of the most important vectors for the transmission of coffeehouse culture, acting as cultural ambassadors for this new institution, even as their very presence in them made the Sultan in Istanbul so nervous. They were simultaneously spreading the culture and reinforcing the authorities' fears about it. The conversation at their table shifts. They are now speaking in low, serious tones. You can't understand the words, but the tone is unmistakable. It's the sound of grievance. Perhaps their pay is late again. Perhaps a new commander is unpopular. Perhaps they feel their privileges are being threatened. This is the sound the Sultan's spies are straining to hear. In the disciplined world of the barracks, such talk would be impossible. But here, softened by the comfortable cushions, unstimulated by the dark, bitter coffee, resentments can be aired, and a sense of collective identity and shared purpose can be forged. The Janissaries came to the coffeehouse to feel like ordinary men, but in doing so, they often became more aware of their extraordinary power. The night deepens, and the coffee continues to flow. The crowd has thinned to its core of dedicated patrons, and the atmosphere has grown more intense, more focused. The light from the oil lamp seems to pool on the faces of the men, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. It's in this intimate, charged environment that another, more dangerous, function of the coffeehouse emerges. This is no longer just a place for news or gossip. It has become a crucible for art and politics, a place where words are forged into weapons. In one corner, a man with fiery eyes and ink-stained fingers is reciting poetry. But this isn't the epic storytelling of the Meddah or the romantic verses you might hear in a more genteel setting. This is different. His voice is a low, rhythmic growl, full of passion and anger. He is a poet, but his subject is not love or nature. It is injustice. He speaks of the arrogance of the wealthy, the corruption of officials, the suffering of the poor. He doesn't name names, of course. He's not suicidal. He speaks in metaphors, using historical allegories and complex symbols. He might decry the actions of a tyrannical vizier from a century ago, but everyone in the room knows exactly who he is really talking about. This is the birth of a new kind of political discourse. The coffeehouse became the salon for what historians call the dissident poets. These were educated men, often from the lower rungs of the religious or administrative classes, who were frustrated with the state of the empire and their own lack of opportunity. They were masters of the intricate rules of classical Ottoman poetry, but they turned that art form on its head. They used its refined and beautiful structures to deliver scathing social and political critiques. This is a well-established part of the literary history of the period. Coffeehouses were their stage and their sanctuary, the only public place where such challenging work could find an audience. The listeners are rapt. Some nod in solemn agreement. Others glance nervously towards the door. This is exhilarating, but it's also dangerous. The poet is walking a tightrope. A single misplaced word, a metaphor that is too transparent, could land him in prison. The coffeehouse provides him with a sympathetic audience, a protective crowd. There is safety in numbers, or so he hopes. Nearby, another group is engaged in a different kind of challenging conversation. They are not poets, but they are discussing ideas that are just as radical. They could be students of a particular Sufi mystic, debating points of theology that veer close to what the Orthodox establishment would consider heresy. Or they could be discussing new ideas in science and philosophy, ideas trickling in from Europe through merchants and travelers. Perhaps they are debating the merits of the new Copernican model of the universe, with the sun at the center instead of the earth. Such a discussion would be impossible in the rigid, traditional environment of a madrasa, an Islamic school. But here, in the intellectually free and unregulated space of the coffeehouse, any idea was fair game. This brings us to a specific and fascinating niche character you might find in a coffeehouse: the out-of-work intellectual. The Ottoman bureaucracy was vast, but there were far more educated men than there were government jobs. This created a class of what we might call freelance scholars or underemployed scribes. These men were highly literate, often multilingual, and well-versed in theology, law, and literature, but they had no official position. The coffeehouse was their office, their university, and their support group. Here, they could debate with their peers, show off their knowledge, write poetry, and perhaps pick up small jobs writing a petition for an illiterate artisan, or a love letter for a Loveland soldier. The academic debate here is about the true impact of all this talk. Did the dissident poetry and radical philosophical discussions in the coffeehouses actually lead to political change? Or was it all just talk, a harmless way for frustrated men to blow off steam? One school of thought argues that the coffeehouse was a genuine engine of political change. The ideas formulated and spread here created a critical public opinion that rulers had to, at least sometimes, take into account. They point to instances where public outcry, incubated in coffeehouses, lead to the dismissal of an unpopular official or the reversal of a new tax. Another school of thought is more skeptical. They argue that the Sultan and his state apparatus are too powerful to be truly threatened by a few angry poets and amateur philosophers. They suggest that the state allowed coffeehouses to exist, even with their dissident chatter, precisely because they were a safety valve. It was better to let these men complain in a coffeehouse, where they could be monitored by spies, than to have them plotting in secret in their homes. According to this view, the political ferment of the coffeehouse was a carefully managed illusion of freedom, not a real threat to the established order. The debate is ongoing, and it cuts to the heart of the question of power and public opinion in authoritarian state. The poet in the corner finishes his recitation. There is no applause. That would be too loud, too obvious. Instead, there is a low murmur of approval, a collective sigh of appreciation and shared sentiment. He has put their own unspoken feelings into beautiful, dangerous words. One of the Janissaries who had been listening intently pushes a small coin across the floor towards the poet, a gesture of solidarity. It's a powerful moment. The soldier and the poet, the sword and the word, finding common cause in the smoky, amber-lit warmth of the coffeehouse. This is precisely the kind of alliance that gave the Sultan nightmares. The air in the room, already thick with tobacco smoke and political tension, seems to grow heavier still. A man who had been sitting quietly by the door, nursing a single cup of coffee for the past hour, gets up and leaves without a word. A few moments later, you hear a commotion outside, not loud, but sharp and official. The low hum of conversation inside the coffeehouse falters and dies. Men look at each other, their eyes wide with alarm. The owner, who was just sharing a quiet joke with a regular, straightens up, his face pale. The moment that everyone has feared, the moment that has been a constant, unspoken threat hanging over these gatherings, has finally arrived. The door swings open violently. Two men stand on the threshold. They are not customers. They are members of the SOAS, the city's police force, identifiable by their stern expressions and the authority they carry like a weapon. Behind them, you can see the flickering torchlight of more guards out in the alley. One of the officers unrolls a scrolling, in a loud, clear voice that rings with official power. He begins to read from a firman, a royal decree issued by the Sultan himself. The decree is a litany of accusations. It declares that coffee is an illicit substance, an innovation that encourages vice. It proclaims that coffeehouses are dens of iniquity, breeding grounds for gossip, slander, and seditious talk fitna. They are places where men waste their time, neglect their families, and forget their prayers. They are a threat to public morality and the good organism of the empire. Therefore, by the will of the Sultan, all coffeehouses in the city of Istanbul are to be closed, effective immediately. Their owners are to be punished, and their patrons are to disperse. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This really happened. The first major shutdown of coffeehouses in Istanbul occurred during the reign of Sultan Murad I in the late 16th century, though the most famous and brutal crackdown would come later, under Murad IV. The reasons given in the official decrees were always moral and religious. The Sultan was presenting himself as the guardian of piety and public order, protecting his flock from a corrupting influence. This is the official, mainstream explanation for the coffeehouse prohibitions. The patrons in the room are frozen. Some look terrified, others defiant. The poet who was just reciting his verses seems to shrink into the shadows. The Janissaries, for the first time, look uncertain. Their personal prestige is great, but challenging a direct order from the Sultan is another matter entirely. The police officers step into the room. They walk over to the hearth and, with a symbolic and brutal kick, they knock over the pot where the water was bubbling, spilling it into the embers. A great hiss and a cloud of steam rise from the fire, extinguishing its warm glow. The heart of the coffeehouse has been killed. They then begin ordering everyone out, their voices sharp and uncompromising. Now, here's a more niche, and perhaps cynical, take on these closures. While the official reason was always morality, many historians argue that the real motivations were a complex mix of politics and economics. We've already seen the political fears. The Sultan and his vizier Arrests were terrified of the uncontrollable public discourse that coffeehouses fostered. But there was also an economic angle. The owners of the city's thousands of taverns mayhem were losing a lot of business to the coffeehouses. Coffee was a cheap, non-alcoholic, and respectable alternative, and it was drawing away their clientele. The tavern owners, who paid significant taxes to the state, likely formed a powerful lobby, complaining to the authorities that these untaxed or lightly taxed coffeehouses were ruining them. So the moral crusade against coffee might have been, in part, a cover for some good old-fashioned protectionism, siding with an established industry against a disruptive new competitor. This leads to a fascinating historical debate. What was the true primary driver of the coffeehouse bans? Was it religious piety, political fear, or economic pressure? Historians who favor the religious explanation point to the genuine and powerful conservative clerical movements of the time, which saw coffee as a dangerous innovation in the same category as printing presses and other new ideas. Those who champion the political explanation argue that the state's obsession with fitna and control was the overwhelming factor, and religion was just a convenient excuse. A third group focuses on the economic motives, following the money and the complaints of rival businesses. The most likely answer, of course, is that it wasn't one single reason, but a perfect storm of all three. The religious scholars provided the justification, the tavern owners provided the pressure, and the Sultan's own political fears provided the motivation. You find yourself being pushed towards the door along with the other patrons. The cozy warmth is gone, replaced by the cold night air and the intimidating presence of the city guard. The owner of the coffeehouse is being led away, his head bowed. The dream is over. The school of the wise has been forcibly shut down. You step out into the dark alley, the scent of spilled coffee and extinguished embers clinging to your clothes. The murmur of conversation is gone, replaced by an unnerving silence. The state has reasserted its control. The brief, beautiful experiment in public discourse has been crushed. Or has it? You're standing in the cold, dark alley, the memory of the war, buzzing coffeehouse already feeling like a distant dream. The city guards are dispersing the crowd, their torches casting menacing, dancing shadows on the walls. The door to the coffeehouse has been barred shut. It seems like a definitive end. The Sultan has spoken, the state has acted, and the brief, vibrant life of the coffeehouse has been snuffed out. But you would be wrong to think it's that simple. This is Istanbul, a city that has mastered the art of survival, and its people are nothing if not resilient and creative. The ban was just the beginning of a new chapter, a city-wide game of cat and mouse. The official closure of the coffeehouses didn't eliminate the demand for coffee or the need for social spaces. It just pushed them underground. The desire for that bitter black drink and the stimulating conversation that came with it was too strong to be legislated away. So the coffeehouse didn't die. It just became clandestine. You might see it a few days later. You're walking down a different street, and you see a man you recognize from that night, one of the merchants. He catches your eye and gives a subtle, almost imperceptible nod towards an nondescript doorway. There's no sign, no warm light spilling out. It looks like a private home. But if you were to follow him inside, you would find a familiar scene. A small, hidden room, perhaps in the back of a shop or in a private residence, where a handful of men are quietly sipping coffee, served from a single CECV heated over a small brazier. These were the first speakers, yes. This is the well-known historical outcome of the prohibitions. The bans were, in the long run, completely unenforceable. The city was too large, its network of alleys and hidden courtyards too complex. For every coffeehouse the guards shut down, two more would pop up in secret locations. The owners and patrons became masters of deception. A barber shop might have a back room where the real business was serving coffee. A baker might keep a pot brewing for trusted customers who knew the right word to say. It turned a simple daily pleasure into a thrilling, illicit act. This period of prohibition gives us a truly niche and fascinating insight into the city's social fabric. The rise of the mobile coffee vendor. Since a permanent, stationary coffee house was a target, some enterprising individuals decided to take their business on the road. You would see men walking the streets with a large, insulated brass container of pre-made coffee strapped to their back. They carried a few small cups tucked into a belt and a charcoal-fueled heater to keep the coffee warm. They were essentially walking cafes. They had a distinctive cry to announce their presence and would serve a quick cup to a thirsty shopkeeper or a group of laborers on their break. This was a brilliant adaptation. They were mobile, hard to catch, and served the needs of people who could no longer go to their favorite coffee house. It was a grassroots response to a top-down decree. The academic debate surrounding this period of prohibition is a lively one. Did the bans ultimately strengthen or weaken the coffeehouse culture? On one hand, you could argue they weakened it. The large, open, democratic schools of the wise were gone. They were replaced by smaller, more exclusive, and more paranoid gatherings. The free-flowing exchange of information was hampered by the need for secrecy. The element of fear might have stifled the very open debate that had made the original coffeehouses so vibrant. On the other hand, a compelling argument can be made that the bans, paradoxically, strengthened the culture in the long run. The act of defying the Sultan's ban together created a powerful bond among the patrons. It imbued the simple act of drinking coffee with a sense of rebellion and solidarity. It made the coffeehouse not just a social space, but a symbol of resistance to arbitrary authority. Furthermore, the secrecy may have filtered out the more casual customers, leaving behind a core of true believers, the poets, the intellectuals, the politically engaged, making the discussions in these hidden spaces even more focused and intense. Historians sift through court records from the time, looking at the number of arrests and the types of people caught, to try and gauge the true effect of the closures. The evidence is ambiguous, suggesting that both arguments have some merit. You can imagine the owner of your original coffeehouse. Maybe he was arrested and fined, but after a short while, he was released. The state didn't have the resources to imprison every coffeehouse owner in the city. So what does he do? He can't reopen his old place, so he adapts. He might pay a friendly neighbor to let him use their basement. He sends word through his network of trusted regulars, telling them the new, secret location. The game continues. The authorities were not stupid. Of course, they knew this was happening. The spies and informants who used to sit inside the coffeehouses now had to work harder, trying to find these hidden locations. It led to a constant state of low-level warfare on the streets of Istanbul, a battle of wits between the state and its caffeine-loving citizens. The government would announce a new crackdown. The guards would conduct a few high-profile raids, and things would go quiet for a week. But then, slowly, a mobile vendor would appear on a street corner. A back room would quietly open for business, and the familiar, rich aroma of roasting coffee would once again begin to drift through the city's hidden alleys. The Sultan could ban the coffeehouse, but he couldn't ban the conversation. You found your way into one of these new, clandestine coffee gatherings. It's in the cellar of a textile merchant's house, the air tasting of damp stone and the faint, sweet smell of wool, now overlaid with the familiar, comforting aroma of coffee. The space is small, cramped, and dimly lit by a single, smoky oil lamp. There are only a dozen men here, all of them faces you recognize from the old place. The atmosphere is hushed, conspiratorial. The boisterous laughter of the Karagöz show and the confident declamations of the Medda are gone. Here, every sound is muted, every word is weighed. This is a coffeehouse under siege, and it has adapted by developing its own secret language. As you sit and listen, you begin to notice it. The men are not speaking plainly, especially when the topic turns to politics or other sensitive matters. They are using a kind of code, a shared vocabulary of metaphor and delusion that is completely opaque to an outsider, but perfectly clear to the initiated. This is a natural evolution. When free speech is suppressed, people don't stop speaking. They just learn to speak in whispers and riddles. A man might complain about the high price of black pepper, but from the knowing glances around the room, you understand he is not talking about spices. Black pepper might be the code for a new, unpopular tax. Another man might ask if anyone has heard from our friend in Edirne, a city that was once the empire's capital. Our friend in Edirne could be a coded reference to a disgraced vizier who has been exiled there. A way of asking for news about court intrigue without mentioning any names. The Sultan might be referred to as the head gardener or the master of the house, and his powerful Grand Vizier as the head steward. This is a well-documented linguistic phenomenon in societies living under authoritarian rule, and the Ottoman coffeehouses became masters of it. They also developed an nonverbal language. A man might tap his cup twice on the saucer to signal his agreement with a risky statement, a silent form of applause. A subtle hand gesture could indicate that someone new has entered the room and that the conversation should shift to safer topics, like the weather or the price of bread. It turned conversation into a dance, a careful choreography of words and silence designed to keep everyone safe. Here's a particularly niche and fascinating aspect of this coded communication: the use of poetry and literature. We've already seen how dissident poets used metaphor to criticize the powerful. But during the crackdowns, this became even more important. A line of classical Persian poetry, seemingly about a long-dead, unjust king, could be recited to comment on a current event. The ability to understand these literary allusions became a shibboleth, a test of whether you were truly part of the in-group. It was a high-culture code. If you understood the reference, you were trusted. If you didn't, you were an outsider and potentially a spy. This elevated the intellectual stakes of being a coffeehouse patron. You didn't just need to have an opinion. You needed the literary knowledge to express it safely. This brings up a significant historical debate. How widespread and formalized was this coffeehouse code? Was it a highly structured secret language, a thieves' cant for intellectuals, or was it more informal and improvised, a collection of constantly shifting slang and inside jokes? Some historians argue for a more formalized system. They point to the recurring metaphors found in the poetry and satirical writings of the period as evidence of a stable, shared vocabulary of dissent. They suggest that new patrons would have to be taught the code by more experienced members. Other historians argue that this overstates the case. They believe the language was much more fluid and context-dependent. A metaphor that was safe to use one week might be dangerous the next, especially if the authorities caught on to its meaning. In this view, the skill was not in knowing a fixed code, but in being a nimble and creative linguistic improviser, able to invent new ways to say forbidden things on the fly. The truth is likely a combination of both. There were probably some stable, well-known codes like referring to the Sultan indirectly, as well as a great deal of spontaneous, localized invention. It's a difficult thing to prove definitively, as people who are successfully using a secret code are, by definition, not leaving clear records of it for future historians to find. You watch as the host of this secret gathering, the textile merchant, pours another round of coffee. He does it silently, his movements economical. The coffee itself seems to have taken on a new meaning. It's no longer just a social lubricant. It's a sacrament of secrecy, a shared communion for a circle of trust. The act of drinking it together in this hidden room is a quiet pledge of mutual protection. Every man in this cellar is putting his safety in the hands of the others. The trust required is immense. One of the men makes a joke, a quiet pun based on a line from the Quran, that subtly mocks a well-known conservative cleric. A few of the men smile, a brief flicker of humor in the tense atmosphere. It's a small, fleeting moment, but it's an act of intellectual rebellion. In this cramped cellar, surrounded by the smell of damp earth, These men are keeping the spirit of the school of the wise alive. They are using their shared knowledge and their secret language to build a small, invisible fortress of free thought right under the nose of the empire. As you sit in this hidden cellar, surrounded by men whispering coded critiques of the state, a question might naturally arise in your modern mind. Where are the women? You look around the cramped space, and the answer is clear. They aren't here. The Coffeehouse, from its very inception in Istanbul, was an overwhelmingly male domain. This wasn't because of any specific law, but because of the deeply ingrained social customs of the time, which strictly segregated public life along gender lines. The public sphere that the Coffeehouse so radically created was, in reality, a men's public sphere. This is the standard and historically accurate understanding. For a respectable woman of almost any social class, to be seen entering a coffeehouse would have been a major social scandal. These places were considered rough, smoky, and associated with political intrigue, not a suitable environment for a woman whose domain was considered to be the harem alik, the private, domestic quarters of the home. The worlds were separate. Men had the public coffeehouse. Women had the private bathish, the harem, which served as their primary space for socializing outside the home. However, to simply say women were excluded is to tell only half the story. The reality was, as always, more complex and interesting. Women were not entirely absent from the world of coffee. Their relationship with it was just different, and often invisible to the male-dominated historical record. For a start, women certainly drank coffee. It quickly became a staple beverage within the home. A husband who frequented the coffeehouses would bring the habit and the beans back to his own household. Preparing coffee for the family and for guests became a key part of a woman's domestic duties and hospitality rituals. This leads to a truly fascinating and niche piece of social history, found within the Islamic court records of 16th century Istanbul. There's a particular legal clause that began to appear in marriage contracts and divorce proceedings from this period. A woman could, in some cases, legally divorce her husband if he failed to provide her with an adequate daily supply of coffee. This is not a joke. It's a real and documented legal principle. Coffee had become so essential to daily life and domestic happiness that its provision was considered a basic household necessity, on par with bread and shelter. A husband's failure to provide it was seen as a legitimate grievance, grounds for dissolving a marriage. This tells you everything you need to know about how quickly and deeply coffee integrated itself into the fabric of everyday life, for women as well as for men. The question of women's role in relation to the coffeehouse is a subject of ongoing academic inquiry, and it's a perfect example of how historians have to read against the grain of their sources. The official histories, written by men, barely mention women in this context. So how do we know about their relationship with coffee? Historians have had to get creative. They look at household account books to see how much money was spent on coffee beans. They study those court records for divorce cases. They analyze poetry and folk songs, looking for mentions of women drinking coffee. They even look at the probate inventories of wealthy women's estates to see if they own their own personal, ornate coffee-making sets. This research has led to a debate. To what extent did women participate in the coffee culture, even if they weren't in the coffeehouses? One view is that their role was purely domestic and passive. They consumed coffee, but they were cut off from the vibrant intellectual and political life of the coffeehouse. Their coffee was quiet, domestic, and apolitical. Another, more recent view argues that women created their own parallel coffee culture within the female-only spaces of the harem lik. When women gathered in their homes or visited each other, the serving of coffee was a central ritual. And while they might not have been debating the Janissary's pay, they were certainly exchanging news, sharing information, and engaging in their own forms of social and political discourse. A woman whose husband was a palace official might share a piece of court gossip with her neighbor, whose husband was a merchant. This female information network, fueled by coffee served in private courtyards and sitting rooms, was just as real and important as the male network in the coffeehouse, even if it has been largely ignored by history. They were not just passive consumers. They were active participants in the circulation of information, just in a different, less visible arena. As for the coffeehouses themselves, was the exclusion truly absolute? It's likely that women of the respectable classes were never present. But what about other women? The women who sold food on the streets, or traveling entertainers, or women from the lowest rungs of society who lived outside the strictures of convention. It's possible, though very hard to prove, that some of these women might have occasionally entered the less reputable coffeehouses, perhaps as vendors or performers. The historical record is mostly silent, leaving us to speculate. You take a final look around the cellar. It's a room full of men, a snapshot of a patriarchal society. But now you understand that this is not the whole picture. The coffee revolution was not just a male revolution. In the houses and courtyards all across this great city, a quieter, parallel revolution was taking place, one cup at a time, in the hands of the city's women. Their story is not written in the grand chronicles, but in the fine print of a marriage contract and the steam rising from a cup in a private room. Let's shift your perspective. You're still in the same cramped, secret coffee gathering, but I want you to focus on one man in particular. HES sitting by himself in a corner, observing everything with a keen, analytical eye. HES not an Ottoman. His clothes are different, a finer wool, a different cut. His face is paler, and his beard is trimmed in a style you might see in Venice. HES listening intently, not just to the words, but to the entire experience. HES a European merchant, perhaps from Venice or Genoa, one of the many foreigners who lived and worked in the protected enclaves of Istanbul. And for him, this isn't just a fascinating cultural experience. It's a business opportunity. He takes a sip of his coffee, his face a mask of careful consideration. HES tasting the drink. Yes, but HES also tasting the idea. He is analyzing the entire concept. A public place, open to all classes, that serves a stimulating, non-alcoholic beverage and encourages hours of conversation, networking, and business. In the mercantile, capitalist world of Venice, this idea is revolutionary. The social hubs he knows back home are taverns, where alcohol clouds judgment and lead to brawls, or the public squares, which are chaotic and lack privacy. This is different. It's civilized, it's intellectual, and it's good for business. This moment, this act of quiet observation by a foreign merchant, is the crucial first step in the migration of the coffeehouse from the Ottoman East to the Christian West. The mainstream history of coffee in Europe usually begins with its arrival in Venice in the early 17th century. Venetian merchants, who had the most extensive trading relationship with the Ottoman Empire, were the first to commercially import coffee beans to the European continent. They initially sold it as a medicinal product through pharmacies, at a very high price. But very soon, inspired by what they had seen in Istanbul and other Ottoman cities, they opened the first European coffeehouse, or Gas, the famous Ca' Florian in Venice's street. Marx Square, which is still in operation today, traces its lineage back to this period, opening in 1720, long after the initial trend had been set. But here is a more nichent telling detail about this transfer of culture. When coffee first arrived in Europe, it faced the same kind of suspicion it had faced in the Islamic world, but with a new, xenophobic twist. Conservative voices in the West didn't just worry about it being an intoxicant. They condemned it as the bitter invention of Satan. They saw it as the drink of the infidel Turk, a dangerous Muslim beverage that would corrupt good Christians. There was a legend, likely apocryphal but widely told, that the Pope, Clement VIII, was petitioned by his advisors to ban the devil's drink. The Pope, however, decided he should taste it first. He was served a cup, and he found it so delicious and refreshing that he reportedly declared, "Why, this Satan's drink is so delicious that it would be a pity to let the infidels have exclusive use of it. We shall fool Satan by baptizing it and making it a truly Christian beverage." By giving coffee his papal blessing, he effectively neutralized the religious opposition and paved the way for its widespread acceptance across Catholic Europe. The academic debate here revolves around the question of adaptation versus direct copying. When the coffeehouse concept was transplanted to Europe, how much was changed in the process? One school of thought argues that the first European coffeehouses were essentially direct copies of their Ottoman predecessors. They tried to replicate the atmosphere, the social mixing, and the focus on news and conversation. They were seen as exotic, Oriental establishments. A more compelling school of thought, however, emphasizes the process of cultural translation and adaptation. They argue that while the core idea was borrowed, it was immediately transformed to fit a European context. For example, while the Ottoman coffeehouse had its platforms and cushions, European coffeehouses adopted tables and chairs, reflecting a different set of social norms about posture and personal space. While the Ottoman coffeehouses were hubs for dissident poets and religious scholars, the coffeehouses of London would become penny universities, where men would pay a penny for admission and a cup of coffee, and engage in scientific and commercial debate. The coffeehouses of Paris would become the hotbeds of Enlightenment philosophy. Eventually, the French Revolution. The core DNA was Ottoman, but the organism evolved differently in each new environment. The Venetian merchant in the corner of your cellar finishes his coffee. He has seen enough. In his mind, he is already making calculations. He is thinking about the cost of importing the beans, the price he could charge per cup, the kind of clientele he could attract. He is mentally redesigning the space to appeal to a Venetian sensibility. He is, in this moment, a bridge between two worlds. He's about to take this powerful social technology, forged in Yemen, refined in Cairo, and perfected in the smoky rooms of Istanbul, and introduce it to a continent that it will go on to fundamentally reshape. You watch him stand up and give a quiet, respectful nod to the host before slipping out into the night. He carries with him more than just the memory of a good cup of coffee. He carries with him an idea that will spawn Lloyd's of London, which started as a coffeehouse for insuring ships, the London Stock Exchange, and 1,000 revolutionary pamphlets. The quiet revolution that began in this city is about to go global. The years, and then the decades, begin to blur. The cycle of prohibition and quiet resurgence has repeated itself several times. The game of cat and mouse between the authorities and the coffee drinkers has become a familiar, almost ritualistic dance. But with each turn of this cycle, something profound has happened. The coffeehouse has ceased to be a shocking novelty or a dangerous new vice. It has sunk its roots deep into the soil of Istanbul's daily life. It has become a habit, an institution, a way of life. Let's fast forward your perspective. It's no longer the mid-16th century. Perhaps it's the early 17th century now. The son, or even the grandson, of the man who first hesitantly pushed open that coffeehouse door is now a regular patron himself. For him, the coffeehouse is not a strange and exotic new place. It's just where you go. It's where his father went, and where he meets his friends. The sense of radical, revolutionary newness has faded, and in its place is a feeling of comforting, everyday familiarity. The coffeehouses themselves have become more established, more permanent. The most successful ones are no longer hidden in cellars. The periodic bans still happen, but they are shorter, less effective, and often ignored by corrupt local officials who are paid off by the wealthy coffeehouse owners. The business is now a recognized part of the city's economy. The coffeehouse owners have even formed their own guild, a powerful organization that can lobby the authorities, regulate its own members, and protect its collective interests. This is a major, mainstream historical development. The institutionalization of the coffeehouse. It has gone from being an outlaw to being a legitimate and powerful part of the establishment. You can see the change in the atmosphere. The spaces are often larger, more ornate. The owner might have invested in more beautiful rugs, more comfortable cushions, perhaps even elegant tiled panels on the walls. The service is smoother, more professional. The frantic energy of a new trend has been replaced by the steady, confident hum of a mature institution. The culture, too, has solidified. The rituals are now second nature to everyone. The glass of water to cleanse the palate. The slow, deliberate sipping of the hot, thick coffee. The final, contemplative moment as you wait for the grounds to settle at the bottom of the cup. These are no longer new actions to be learned. They are the familiar grammar of daily social life. Going to the coffee house is now a fixed point in the daily schedule for a huge number of the city's men. They might go in the morning, after prayers, to catch up on the night's news. They might go in the afternoon, to take a break from work and play a game of backgammon. Or they might go in the evening, for entertainment and deeper conversation. Here is a small, but telling, detail about this period of institutionalization. A new word has entered the Turkish language. Tiayaki. Today, it means addict, usually in a negative sense. But in the 17th century, a kayativ or yakai desai, or a coffee addict, was not necessarily a negative term. It simply meant a connoisseur, a regular, a devotee of the coffeehouse lifestyle. It was a term of identity. To be a Ayaryaki was to be a man of a certain urban sophistication. It meant you had your favorite coffeehouse, your favorite seat, and the owner knew your order without you having to ask. It implied you were a man who was well informed, sociable, and part of the city's vibrant public life. The creation of this term shows that coffee drinking had transcended being a simple activity and had become a full-fledged subculture. This leads to a subtle but important academic debate about the social impact of this normalization. Did the coffeehouse lose its revolutionary edge as it became part of the mainstream? One perspective is that yes, it did. As the coffeehouses became more established and business-oriented, they may have become less tolerant of the truly radical poets and thinkers who could scare away paying customers or attract the unwanted attention of the authorities. The process of becoming a legitimate business ended down the rough, rebellious edges. The school of the wise became more of a common room of the comfortable. The opposing view argues that this normalization actually made the coffeehouse more influential, not less, by becoming a universal, everyday institution for a huge swath of the male population. Its influence became broader and more deeply embedded. The slow, daily drip of news, ideas, and critical opinions shared in these thousands of coffeehouses had a more profound long-term effect on society than the occasional fiery, radical poem. The revolution didn't stop. It just became quieter, more pervasive, and more integrated into the very fabric of the culture. It was no longer a loud explosion. It was a slow, steady erosion of absolute authority. You are sitting now in a large, well-lit coffeehouse. It's mid-afternoon. The room is full, but the atmosphere is relaxed, almost lazy. A game of chess in one corner has drawn a small crowd of quiet spectators. A group of off-duty soldiers is laughing at a joke. A man is dozing in a sunny spot, his empty coffee cup beside him. This is the coffeehouse in its mature phase. It's no longer a hotbed of sedition, at least not openly. It is, as the sociologist and anachronistic ally might call it, the city's third place, that essential space between the home and the workplace where community is built and society happens. The revolution is over, not because it was defeated, but because, in its own quiet way, it had won. You've become one of them. You are no longer a visitor, a time-traveling observer. You are a Ayaki. You have your spot. It's on the raised platform over by the window, where the afternoon light is best for reading and you can feel the faint breeze from the street. You've been coming here for years. The owner, or perhaps his son, greets you with a familiar nod. The apprentice, who is now a young man with the first hint of a mustache, doesn't even need to ask for your order. He knows. Sade. Plain. No sugar. He brings you your coffee and the customary glass of water without a word. A seamless, practiced ritual. You've earned your place here through sheer persistence. You've sat through the heated political debates, the hushed gossip, the epic tales of the Middah, and the raucous laughter of the Karagöz shows. You've seen fashions change and viziers fall. You've watched young men become fathers and old men become memories. The coffeehouse is no longer just a building. It is a landscape of faces, a living archive of the neighborhood's life. You are part of its memory now, and it is part of yours. From your vantage point, you watch the eternal ebb and flow of the coffeehouse. Newcomers still arrive, just as you once did. You can spot them easily. They have a certain hesitation in their movements, a look of wide-eyed wonder and slight confusion. They are still trying to learn the unspoken rules. Where to sit, how to order, how loud to speak. You see a group of young men, perhaps students from a nearby madrasa, trying a little too hard to look like seasoned intellectuals. Their debates a bit too loud, their pronouncements a bit too grand. You smile to yourself. You were one of them once. This is the classic image of the coffeehouse regular, the old-timer or the wise elder of the establishment. He is a stock character in the literature and folklore of the period. He is the man who has seen it all, the unofficial historian and keeper of the coffeehouse's culture. He is the one who can settle a dispute about a historical fact, or explain a particularly obscure line of poetry, or tell a newcomer the story of how the neighborhood has changed over the last 50 years. This leads to an niche and rather poignant aspect of this old-timer culture, the guarding of tradition. As the coffeehouses evolved and sometimes became more commercialized, it was often the Tiryakis, the old guard regulars, who acted as a conservative force. They were the ones who would complain if a new order changed the blend of coffee, or if a storyteller's tales became too vulgar, or if the proper rituals of service were not observed. They were the self-appointed guardians of authenticity. The new owner might want to attract a younger, fleshier crowd, but he would have to contend with the silent, disapproving judgment of the old man in the corner who remembered how things used to be. The academic debate here is a subtle one, concerning the nature of social space. Does the space define the social interactions within it, or do the social interactions define the space? The space defines interaction argument would say that the physical layout of the coffeehouse, the open plan, the shared platforms is what created the democratic, conversational culture. The architecture itself forced people to interact in a certain way. The interaction defines space argument, which has gained more traction in recent years, would say the opposite. It wasn't the physical room that was important. It was the idea of the coffeehouse, the set of social practices and expectations that the patrons brought with them. According to this view, you could create a coffeehouse in a basement, in a tent, or in a street corner, as long as the people present adhered to the unwritten rules of coffeehouse conduct. Conversation, respect, and a shared focus on the intellectual and social life of the group. The existence of the old-timers, the Tiryakis who carry the culture with them, is strong evidence for this second view. They are the living embodiment of the coffeehouse's software, able to install it in any hardware they happen to occupy. You watch as two men at a nearby table begin to set up a backgammon board. The click-clack of the pieces as they are laid out is one of the most iconic sounds of the coffeehouse. The game, known as Tovla, is more than just a pastime. It's a mental duel, a blend of luck and skill, and it is deeply woven into the fabric of this place. The game is a conversation in itself, full of strategy, friendly taunts, and shared moments of tension and relief. Your coffee arrives. You take the first sip. The taste is as familiar to you as the face of an old friend. It is bitter, strong, and comforting. It is the taste of countless afternoons spent in this very spot. You are no longer just observing history. You are living. You are a quiet, fixed point in the ever-turning wheel of the city. The young men will get older. The gossip will change. The empire will face new challenges. But you will be here, in your corner, with your cup of black coffee, watching it all unfold, one slow, deliberate sip at a time. From your comfortable, established seat in the coffee house, you begin to notice the world outside the window changing in subtle, then significant ways. The story of the coffee house has, up to this point, been set against the backdrop of a powerful, confident, and expanding Ottoman Empire. But no empire lasts forever. The late 16th and 17th centuries, the very period when the coffee house was cementing its place in society, were also a time when the empire began to face a series of profound challenges. It was a long, slow transition from a peak of power into a period of military stalemate, economic strain, and internal political turmoil. This is the Great Decline narrative of the Ottoman Empire, a major theme in world history. You can see the symptoms of this change reflected in the conversations around you. The news brought by soldiers returning from the front is no longer one of uninterrupted victories. They speak of long, costly sieges in Hungary or drawn-out, inconclusive campaigns against Persia. The triumphant tone is gone, replaced by a weary pragmatism. The merchants complain more vocally about inflation, about the debasement of the silver currency, about the disruption to trade routes caused by new European naval powers in the Indian Ocean. The Janissaries, now more a powerful political lobby in the capital than a globe-trotting army, are constantly grumbling about their pay and privileges, their plots and king-making becoming more brazen. The Coffeehouse, which was born during the empire's golden age, now becomes the primary theater where the anxieties of a changing world are processed. The dissident poets have more material than ever before. The political debates become more urgent, more fearful. The gossip is darker, full of rumors about corruption at the highest levels and incompetence on the battlefield. The school of the wise is now offering a continuous, real-time course on the difficult subject of imperial decline. But here is the fascinating paradox, and a more niche historical observation. As the political and military power of the Ottoman Empire began its long, slow twilight, the cultural power of its most famous invention, the coffeehouse, was entering its dawn. The two trends moved in opposite directions. The coffeehouse was one of the empire's most successful and enduring cultural exports, and its global spread accelerated, even as the empire's borders began to shrink. You can see the seeds of this right here in your own coffeehouse. That Venetian merchant you saw decades ago was just the first of many. Now it's common to see European travelers, diplomats, and artists sketched away in a corner, diligently taking notes on everything they see. They are not just here for the coffee. They are here to study a successful social institution. They are documenting the art of the Medda, the design of the CZV, the rules of backgammon. They are a sign that the flow of cultural influence is no longer a one-way street. While the Ottoman military was slowly losing ground to European armies, the Ottoman coffeehouse was conquering London, Kars, and Vienna without firing a shot. This leads to a complex historical debate about the relationship between hard power military and economic strength and soft power cultural influence. Does soft power depend on hard power, or can it have a life of its own? The case of the Ottoman Empire and its coffeehouse is a prime case study. The traditional view might be that the coffeehouse's spread was a consequence of the empire's initial power and prestige. People in Europe were interested in it because it came from the mighty, exotic Ottoman Empire. A more modern interpretation, however, argues that the coffeehouse's success was independent of the empire's political fortunes. The institution was simply a brilliant idea. It fulfilled a universal human need for a sober, affordable, and comfortable social space. It would have been successful no matter where it came from. According to this view, the fact that its global spread coincided with the empire's decline is not a paradox. It's proof that a good cultural idea has its own intrinsic power, separate from the political power of its originators. The empire gave birth to the coffeehouse, but the coffeehouse quickly grew up and left home, finding success on its own terms all over the world. The man sitting across from you's eyes as he puts down a handwritten newsletter. The German infidels have taken another fortress. He mutters to his companion. And the price of wheat from Egypt is up again. There is a weariness in his voice, a sense of a world that is becoming more difficult, more uncertain. But then the apprentice arrives with 2 fresh cups of steaming coffee. The man takes his cup, inhales the rich aroma, and takes a slow, deliberate sip. For a moment, the anxieties of the world fade away. The empire might be waning, but this small, powerful ritual, this moment of shared comfort and conversation, remains. It has become a constant in a world of unsettling change, a small fortress of stability in the heart of a troubled empire. Time continues its relentless march. The 17th century flows into the 18th. The world outside your coffeehouse window is now profoundly different. The Ottoman Empire is no longer the fearsome global superpower it once was. European fashion, technology, and ideas are now flowing into Istanbul, not as a trickle, but as a flood. The coffeehouse, once a radical innovation, is now a deeply traditional institution, a bedrock of the old way of life. And like any institution that survives for centuries, it has begun to change, to specialize, to diversify. The single, all-purpose school of the wise has fractured into 100 different kinds of coffeehouses, each with its own unique character and clientele. You leave your old, familiar spot for a walk through the city, to see this new landscape for yourself. You find that near the Janissary barracks, there are still coffeehouses that are almost exclusively for soldiers. They are rough, loud places, where the talk is of barracks politics and the air is thick with a sense of frustrated power. The old Janissary Corps is now a shadow of its former self, a conservative and often rebellious force resisting the Sultan's attempts at military modernization. Their coffeehouses have become echo chambers of their grievances, bastions of reactionary sentiment. Then you wander into a more commercial district, near the Grand Bazaar. Here, the coffeehouses are all business. They are crowded with merchants, brokers, and tradesmen. The conversations are not about poetry or philosophy, but about commodity prices, shipping news, and credit arrangements. These are not schools of the wise, but schools of the wealthy. Games of chess and backgammon are still played, but often for high stakes. These are the direct ancestors of the London coffeehouses that became financial institutions. The air here doesn't buzz with intellectual ferment. It hums with the sound of money. This specialization is a well-documented phase in the history of the coffeehouse. As the market matured, different establishments began to cater to different niches. It was no longer enough to just serve coffee. You had to offer a specific kind of atmosphere for a specific kind of customer. This leads you to a more unusual and niche type of coffeehouse that emerged during this later period. The storyteller's coffeehouse. While in the early days, a mid-dollar Karagöz puppeteer might perform at any large coffeehouse. Now some establishments became dedicated performance venues. These were the city's theaters. They would hire the most famous storytellers and puppeteers and would often have a proper raised stage and better lighting. The focus here was purely on entertainment. The audience came not to debate politics, but to be enthralled by a story. It marks a separation of the coffeehouse's functions. The news and debate moved to one type of place, while the entertainment moved to another. And then there were the neighborhood coffeehouses. These were smaller, quieter places, tucked away on residential streets. Their patrons were not soldiers or merchants or intellectuals, but simply the men who lived in that particular neighborhood. Here, the talk was local. A marriage, a death, a dispute between neighbors. They functioned as the community's living room, a place for ordinary men to pass the time and maintain social bonds. This diversification has sparked an interesting academic debate. Did this specialization represent a decline or a maturation of the coffeehouse culture? The decline argument posits that something essential was lost. The original coffeehouse's revolutionary power came from the very fact that it mixed everyone together: the soldier, the merchant, the scholar, the artisan. It was this cross-pollination of different social classes and professions that made it so dynamic. By specializing, the coffeehouses were recreating the very social stratification they had once helped to break down. Soldiers now only talk to soldiers, merchants to merchants. The great, unified public sphere had shattered into a dozen smaller, more homogeneous echo chambers. The maturation argument, on the other hand, sees this as a sign of the culture's strength and adaptability. They argue that a single, one-size-fits-all model could not possibly serve the complex needs of a massive, diverse city like Istanbul. Specialization was a natural and healthy response to a growing market. It allowed different communities to create spaces that were perfectly tailored to their own needs. It didn't destroy the public sphere. It just made it more complex and multifaceted. The city no longer had one single living room. It now had hundreds, each with its own distinct personality. You end your walk at one of these new, specialized coffeehouses. This one is known as a haunt for poets and musicians. It is quiet, and the patrons speak in low, respectful tones. In a corner, a man is softly playing an oud. It's melancholic, beautiful notes filling the room. The men here are not discussing politics or business. They are listening, their eyes closed, lost in the music. The coffee here is still the same dark, bitter brew, but its purpose has been subtly refined. It is no longer just a fuel for debate or a catalyst for news. Here, in this quiet, specialized space, it has become a companion to art, a quiet soundtrack to a moment of shared aesthetic beauty. The coffeehouse has proven that it can be anything its patrons need it to be: a newsroom, a stock exchange, a theater, or a concert hall. You return to your old haunt, the coffeehouse by the window, the one that feels like home. The specialized coffeehouses you visited all have their own purpose, their own energy. But here, in this more traditional, neighborhood spot, you can feel all the threads of history coming together. It's a place that still retains a little bit of everything it once was. There's a quiet chess game in one corner, a merchant discussing prices in another, and two old men who look like they've been sitting here since the beginning of time, just watching the world go by. You hold your small porcelain cup, the thin can, in your hands. It's warm, almost hot, against your skin. You look into the dark liquid, its surface shimmering under the light from the window. It's just a cup of coffee. But as you sit here, at the end of this long journey, you realize it is so much more. The small cup contains a universe of history, a silent testament to a quiet revolution that changed the world. Think about everything that had to happen for you to be sitting here, holding this cup. It started with a legendary Ethiopian gathered and his dancing goats, or perhaps more realistically, with Sufi mystics in Yemen seeking a way to stay awake for their prayers. It was a spiritual tool before it was a social one. This is the first, and most fundamental, historical point. Coffee began as an aid to devotion. Then, the drink began to travel. It moved with pilgrims and traders to Mecca, Cairo, and Damascus, transforming from a monastic secret into a public phenomenon. When it finally arrived in Istanbul in the mid-16th century, bought by two Syrian merchants, it found the perfect environment in which to flourish. It created a new kind of social space, the Coffeehouse, a school of the wise where men of all social classes could mix for the first time. It broke down the rigid social barriers of the Ottoman world, creating a new public sphere for news, gossip, and debate. It became the city's living social network. This simple cup in your hands represents that social revolution. It represents the voice of the Medda, the storyteller who held a room captive with just his voice and a stick. It holds the shadow of Karagöz, the mischievous puppet who spoke truth to power through laughter. It carries the echo of the dissident poet's verses, words of protest cloaked in metaphor. It tastes of the dangerous, thrilling conversations that made the Sultan so nervous, the whispers of fitna that lead to spies, prohibitions, and a city-wide game of cat and mouse. Here's a final, slightly niche piece of knowledge to contemplate. Even the cup itself has a story. The small, handleless porcelain cups, the fincans, were often imported from China, another testament to the vast trade networks that converged on Istanbul. The intricate metal holders they sat in, the zirs, were masterpieces of Ottoman metalwork. The very act of drinking the coffee was an aesthetic experience, a meeting of global cultures right in the palm of your hand. The existence of this simple daily ritual has been a constant point of contention for historians. The central debate, which has woven its way through our entire story, is this: was the coffee house a force for social progress and intellectual freedom, or was it a source of social decay and political instability? The answer, as you've seen, is that it was both. It was a school of the wise and a den of iniquity. It was a hub for news and a factory for lies. It was a space for poets and for spies, for rebels and for reactionaries. It was a catalyst for the formation of public opinion, which could be used to hold the powerful to account, but it could also be a place for idle gossip and time wasting. The coffee house was not one thing. It was a mirror that reflected the complex, contradictory, and vibrant society that created it. You look out the window. The city has changed. The empire has changed. The world has changed. But this ritual remains. The coffeehouse culture that was born here has spread to every corner of the globe, transforming into the cafes of Paris, the coffee shops of Seattle, and the countless places worldwide where people gather to talk, to think, to work, and to simply be together. All of them, in some small way, are descendants of this room. They are all children of the quiet revolution that started with a bitter black drink. You raise the cup to your lips. You are not just drinking coffee. You are drinking history. You are tasting the debates, the stories, the rebellions, and the quiet moments of connection that have unfolded in rooms just like this for centuries. It's a history that is both grand and intimate, a story of empires and trade, but also a story of a simple, shared human pleasure. The afternoon light slants slow through the window, painting long, golden rectangles on the floor. The chess game has ended with a quiet handshake. The merchant has packed up his papers and left. The coffee house is entering its calmest, most contemplative hour, the gentle pause between the bustle of the day and the energy of the evening. The air is still and warm, filled with the lingering scent of coffee and the soft, rhythmic ticking of a large clock on the wall, a later European edition that has somehow found its place among the Turkish rugs. You've reached the bottom of your cup. All that remains is the thick, dark sludge of coffee grounds, the mud that holds the fortunes of those who believe. You don't need your fortune told. You've already seen the past, and it is rich enough. You place the cup gently back on its saucer. The small, metallic clink is the only sound in the quiet room. This is your last cup here, in this time, in this place. You have sat in this corner and watched a world transform. You saw a simple beverage spark a social revolution, creating a space that challenged the very foundations of an empire. You witnessed the birth of a public sphere, where news traveled faster than any official decree and a common man's opinion began to matter. You listened to the stories of the Medda, the jokes of the shadow puppets, the dangerous whispers of poets and plotters. You saw the state pushback, the bans and the spies, and you saw the people's creative resilience in the face of that pressure. You saw the coffee house mature from a radical experiment into a beloved institution, a cornerstone of daily life. You saw it diversify, branching out to serve every niche of society. And you saw its core idea, its cultural DNA, travel across the sea, leaving the declining empire to find new life and new forms in the rising powers of the West. The entire journey, from a Sufi monastery in Yemen to a global cultural phenomenon, is a testament to the power of a simple, shared ritual. This is the mainstream historical consensus. The Ottoman coffeehouse was a transformative institution, a crucial for honor to the modern public sphere, the cafe, and the social network. It fundamentally altered how people shared information, formed opinions, and interacted with power. But as you sit here for the last time, consider one final, strange, and almost unanswerable question, a niche thought that historians sometimes ponder. What if coffee had tasted sweet? What if the bean, when roasted, produced a pleasant, sugary flavor instead of a bitter one? Would the coffeehouse have ever become the school of the wise? Bitterness is a flavor associated with medicine, with seriousness, with sobriety. It's a taste that demands your attention, that sharpens the senses. Perhaps it was the very bitterness of the drink that encouraged the serious, intellectual, and oft uncritical nature of the conversations. A sweet drink might have led to a different kind of establishment altogether, a more frivolous, less challenging space. It's a what-if of history that can never be answered, but it highlights how something as small as a taste profile can have profound, unforeseen consequences. The academic world will forever